In the heart of Mesopotamia once stood a city whispered about for centuries, a place where myth and memory blur together, Babylon. Travelers spoke of walls so wide that chariots could race upon them, of hanging gardens that defied the desert air, of a tower that sought to pierce the heavens. Yet behind these marvels lies a question that refuses to fade. How did this civilization, more than 4,000 years ago, acquire such astonishing knowledge in law, astronomy, and mathematics? Some believe the answer rests not solely in human ingenuity, but in something far stranger. Within the clay tablets and broken stelae are hints of teachers described as gods descending from the sky, figures known as the Anunnaki. Were they divine symbols created to embody human imagination? Or were they memories of beings whose origins stretched far beyond Earth? This idea, often dismissed yet impossible to entirely silence, lingers like a shadow behind every discovery unearthed in the ruins of Babylon. Tonight, we step into that shadow, tracing the fragile line between fact and legend, between the wisdom of humankind and whispers of an otherworldly hand. Welcome to historic sleep. If you're drawn to stories like these, the ones that live in the shadows between what we see and what was made to disappear, feel free to like and subscribe only if it feels right, and let me know in the comments where are you watching from and what time is it for you. Right now, I love seeing our little map of watchers light up around the world. The story of Babylon begins long before its name became known across the ancient world. Along the banks of the Euphrates, where the river twists through the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia, small settlements appeared as early as 4000 BCE. Mud brick houses clung to the river's edge, their walls rising and falling with each season's floods. Farmers carved channels into the earth, guiding the river's waters into fields that shimmered with barley and date palms. What would later be called the cradle of civilization was, in its infancy, a landscape of experimentation. How to tame water, how to feed thousands, how to bind communities together with rules that reached beyond the family and the village. Centuries passed, and scattered hamlets gathered into towns. Among them, one would ascend higher than the rest. By the 18th century BCE, Babylon had risen as a center of power under the rule of Hammurabi, a king whose legacy would be etched into stone forever. The pillar known as the Stele of Hammurabi still bears his image, carved in hard black diorite. At the top, the king stands before Shamash, the sun god and bringer of justice, as if receiving divine authority directly from the heavens. Beneath that image, rows of cuneiform signs lay out a code of laws, rules of property, trade, punishment, and protection. These words were more than ink on parchment. They were cut into rock, meant to last as long as the city itself. What fascinates scholars and dreamers alike is the legend surrounding their origin. Was Hammurabi merely codifying customs passed down through generations? Or, as Babylonian tradition held, were these laws spoken into his ear by a god who shone with the light of the sky? The idea that wisdom might descend from beyond the world of men is not unique to Babylon. But here it was written with such finality that later empires would look back to these laws as the roots of justice itself. In the Louvre today, that stone pillar towers silently, a relic from a time when the line between mortal king and divine messenger blurred. The language of Babylon was pressed into wet clay with reed styluses, the wedge-shaped symbols hardened by fire into tablets that endured thousands of years beneath the soil. In these tablets we find not only decrees of kings, but traces of everyday life. Letters of merchants, contracts of marriage, records of rainfall and harvest. More astonishing still, some tablets reveal an obsession with the heavens. Babylonian priests charted the movements of the moon and stars, building calendars that could predict eclipses, mapping constellations that stretched across the sky. Their mathematics, built on a base 60 system, allowed them to measure angles and time with a precision that feels strangely modern. Clay fragments such as the famous Plimpton 322 tablet show arrays of numbers that align with what we now call Pythagorean triples. How could such concepts emerge millennia before Pythagoras walked the earth? To many, this is evidence of a people whose curiosity stretched into every corner of experience, but to others, it hints at something more enigmatic. Could it be, as certain ancient texts suggest, that the knowledge of the stars was not discovered but given? The Babylonian pantheon was vast, a crowded theater of gods and goddesses each holding sway over a piece of existence. Marduk, the fierce warrior, rose as the city's patron deity. Ishtar, goddess of love and war, embodied both creation and destruction. Shamash brought light and judgment. Yet beneath these names lay another layer, spoken in hushed tones, the Anunnaki. They were described as the children of Anu, the sky god, and in Sumerian and Babylonian accounts they descend from above with purpose, sometimes as bringers of wisdom, sometimes as seekers of earthly resources. What they truly were remains tangled between myth and interpretation. Some saw them as spirits that could shift into human form, walking unseen among men. Others whispered of them as star travelers, immortals who carried the sciences of the heavens in their grasp. Within the mythic imagination of Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki stood at the threshold between gods and strangers, their origins forever uncertain. Were they metaphors for nature's forces? Were they symbols of royal authority cloaked in divine language? Or were they memories, however distorted, of visitors not born of earth? The kings of Babylon claimed to rule in the name of these gods, their power legitimized through sacred marriage rites and ceremonies staged in the temples. Within ziggurats, towering step pyramids of mud brick that dominated the skyline, priests conducted rituals that linked heaven and earth. Incense curled upward in smoke, offerings of grain and wine were set before statues that gleamed with precious stones, and chants echoed through halls where the boundary between mortal and divine was thought to blur. In such a world, it is easy to imagine how a code of laws might be explained not as the work of men, but as a gift bestowed from beyond. As Babylon grew, its streets filled with traders from distant lands, spices from Arabia, tin from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. Languages mingled, stories blended, and the city became a crucible of cultures. Yet in every telling, the same aura of wonder hangs over its name. Even centuries later, when Greek historians wrote of Babylon, they described a place where knowledge seemed inexhaustible, where priests studied the skies night after night, searching for signs of destiny written in the stars. This mingling of science and faith, of numbers and omens, defines the mystery that continues to cling to Babylon. Were these priests merely careful observers who catalogued the patterns of the cosmos, or were they heirs to an inheritance whose source we still do not understand? What survives today are fragments, scattered clues pieced together by archaeologists over the last 200 years. Thousands of tablets pulled from the earth at Nineveh and elsewhere reveal a civilization both pragmatic and mystical. They remind us that Babylon was not merely a city of myth, but a living, breathing society whose achievements ripple into our present. Yet the deeper we look, the more questions surface. Why does so much of their knowledge feel centuries ahead of its time? Why do their myths speak of beings descending from the skies, of wisdom imparted from beyond? These questions linger like echoes over the ruins, and as we walk further into the story of Babylon, we must hold both possibilities in mind, that humanity is capable of brilliance beyond expectation, and that perhaps, just perhaps, they were not entirely alone. When one imagines Babylon, it is easy to picture a city of immense walls and palaces, but the truth is more textured, more human. Behind the grandeur, the daily life of its people beat like a constant pulse. The streets were alive with vendors selling bread made from barley, dates pressed into sweet cakes, and oils carried in clay jars. Farmers brought produce from the irrigated fields beyond the city, guiding donkeys laden with grain through crowded gates. Craftsmen worked in narrow workshops, shaping bronze tools, carving stone seals, and weaving cloth dyed in shades of deep blue and red. These everyday rhythms formed the foundation on which the myths and monuments of Babylon stood. And yet, even in the ordinary, the extraordinary lingered. To live in Babylon was to live in a city that believed the heavens spoke directly to its people, that the movements of the stars could shape destinies as surely as the king's decree. The temples were the heart of this belief. Rising above the city was the Ziggurat, the temple tower that the Babylonians called Etemenanki, meaning the foundation of heaven and earth. To the outsider, it might have appeared as a massive mountain of brick stacked into terraces, each level painted in colors that caught the desert light. But to the Babylonians, it was a bridge, a stairway between the world of men and the realm of the gods. Priests ascended its steps in solemn processions, carrying offerings upward, their chants drifting across the city like threads binding the earthly to the divine. It is here, some believe, that the memory of the Tower of Babel was born. In the book of Genesis, the tower became a symbol of human ambition and divine punishment. But in Babylon itself, it was seen as a sacred ladder, a way of linking the finite with the infinite. Inside the ziggurat's shadow, the rituals unfolded with precision. The high priest stood before the statue of Marduk, the great god of Babylon, his form cast in gold and inlaid with jewels. Ritual words were spoken, carefully memorized chants that had been passed down through generations. At certain times of the year, festivals erupted into the streets, the most famous being the Akitu, the New Year festival that lasted for days. During this time, the statue of Marduk was carried in procession, the people cheering as their god moved through the city. Kings themselves humbled their power before him, kneeling to affirm that their right to rule flowed from the divine. In this mingling of ritual and politics, the city bound itself together, not only through walls of brick, but through belief. What fascinates us today is not only the devotion of these people, but the complexity of their systems. The Babylonians did not simply pray to the heavens, they measured them. Night after night, scribes recorded the paths of stars and planets. They noticed cycles, predicted eclipses, and marked patterns that still shape our calendars. To them, the sky was not only a place of gods, but a vast text, each movement a word, each constellation a sentence. They practiced horoscopy, a system by which the position of stars at one's birth could reveal fate. While today such practices are often dismissed as superstition, it is undeniable that Babylonian astronomy laid the groundwork for much of the scientific tradition that followed. What we call the zodiac, with its wheel of signs, is rooted in the charts of those Mesopotamian priests. Later, the Greeks and Romans would adopt and reshape it, but its origin lies in the clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped signs by Babylonian hands. Among the most mysterious of these records are the so-called star catalogues, tablets that describe with astonishing precision the movement of celestial bodies. Found near the banks of the Tigris, these relics reveal a people whose gaze was not only upon the earth, but stretched outward into the cosmos. It is here that speculation begins. Could a people of the Bronze Age truly achieve such accuracy by observation alone? Or, as some claim, did they possess knowledge handed down by beings beyond their world? The suggestion of the Anunnaki returns again, shadowing every attempt to explain how Babylon reached so far, so quickly, into the language of the stars. But life in Babylon was not only ritual and science. The city was a place of law, and its laws touched every corner of existence. The Code of Hammurabi, carved centuries earlier, still resonated. It spoke of justice that matched harm for harm, of protection for the weak, of order maintained through balance. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. These words, born from Babylonian stone, echo even today. Yet to the Babylonians, these were not merely human rules. They were divine decrees, delivered through a king who stood as the emissary of heaven. Justice itself was seen as a gift from the gods, a structure within which human life could flourish. The blending of the sacred and the civic was seamless. There was no division between law and faith, between ruler and priest. In this way, the city became not only a political capital, but a sacred space, where every contract, every trial, every trade carried the weight of cosmic order. Walking the streets of ancient Babylon, one would encounter not only markets and temples, but the very architecture of myth. The Hanging Gardens, though their existence remains uncertain, were said to rise in terraces of greenery, watered by ingenious systems of irrigation that lifted moisture from the river to the highest levels. Whether real or imagined, their legend captured the world's imagination. Ancient writers described trees shading cool courtyards, vines cascading down stone walls, flowers blooming in defiance of the desert air. Some believed they were built by Nebuchadnezzar II for his wife, who longed for the mountains of her homeland. Others argued that they never existed at all, a dream written into history. Yet even as archaeologists search for evidence, the gardens remain one of the 7 wonders, a symbol of human ingenuity, and perhaps, for those who lean toward mystery, another fragment of knowledge that surpassed its time. Through all of this, the question lingers: how much of Babylon was human creation, and how much was the inheritance of something older, stranger, less easily explained? The clay tablets, the monumental architecture, the sophisticated sciences, they all speak of a civilization unmatched in its age. But the stories of the gods, the Anunnaki, and the celestial teachers whisper of another possibility, one that continues to intrigue. Were these myths the poetry of a people striving to explain the unknown, or were they echoes of encounters long forgotten by history, but preserved in symbol? As the sun set over the Euphrates and shadows stretched across the Ziggurat, perhaps the people of Babylon asked themselves the same question, gazing at the night sky that shimmered with secrets. By the 6th century BCE, Babylon had reached its zenith. Under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II, the city became not only a political capital, but the jewel of the ancient world, a metropolis so breathtaking that travelers who later saw its ruins could scarcely believe such splendor had once existed. Nebuchadnezzar's reign stretched from 605 to 562 BCE, and during those decades the city underwent a transformation that left an imprint on history. Towering walls encircled Babylon, walls so wide that it was said chariots could ride abreast atop them. Massive gates guarded its entrances, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate, covered in glazed blue bricks and adorned with dragons, lions, and bulls that gleamed under the Mesopotamian sun. To walk through that gate was to step into a vision of order and power, where art and architecture proclaimed the might of a city blessed by the gods. The processional way, lined with images of sacred animals, led visitors directly into the heart of Babylon, where palaces and temples rose above the city. Nebuchadnezzar poured his wealth into these structures, claiming that he rebuilt Babylon to honor Marduk, the city's patron deity. The Ziggurat, already in ancient form by his time, was reconstructed to monumental heights. Its terraces loomed over the plains, each level a symbol of the bond between heaven and earth. The king's inscriptions tell of his devotion to Marduk, describing himself as chosen to restore the divine order on earth. In his vision, Babylon was not merely a kingdom. It was the earthly reflection of the heavens, the cosmic center from which law, faith, and power radiated. It was during this time that the legend of the Hanging Gardens found fertile ground. Writers centuries later spoke of Nebuchadnezzar building a paradise of greenery for his wife, Amytis of Media, who longed for the lush mountains of her homeland. Terraces were said to rise tier upon tier, with trees, flowers, and vines cascading downward, watered by ingenious mechanisms that lifted water from the river far below. Whether by Archimedean screws or hidden aqueducts, the gardens defied the harsh desert climate, creating a sanctuary of shade and fragrance in the heart of the city. Yet despite the vividness of these accounts, archaeologists have struggled to find definitive proof. Some argue the gardens were not in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib. Others believe they were a poetic invention, a symbol of abundance and beauty rather than a physical structure. Still, the allure of the Hanging Gardens remains irresistible, a wonder of the world whose absence only deepens the mystery. Babylon's grandeur was matched by its role as a crossroads of knowledge. Nebuchadnezzar's empire stretched far, bringing traders, artisans, and scholars from distant lands. Within the city, languages mingled and ideas exchanged. The priests continued their study of the stars, refining astronomical observations with growing precision. In their records, we see the birth of systematic astrology, the belief that the positions of celestial bodies at the moment of birth could reveal a person's fate. To the Babylonians, this was not superstition, but a language of the cosmos, a way of reading the will of the gods written in the sky. Later civilizations, from Egypt to Greece to Rome, would adopt and adapt this system, weaving Babylonian insights into their own cultural fabrics. Even today, echoes of this ancient sky watching linger in the horoscopes that fill newspapers and websites, reminders of a practice rooted in the temples of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not without its shadows. Biblical accounts portray him as a tyrant, the conqueror who destroyed Jerusalem and carried its people into exile. To the Jewish scribes who preserved those memories, Babylon became a symbol of oppression, the very image of prideful empire doomed to fall. Yet, even within these stories, Babylon is painted with awe, a place of wealth, wisdom, and terrifying grandeur. The tension between admiration and condemnation reflects the city's dual nature, a beacon of civilization and a warning of hubris. The Book of Daniel tells of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, interpreted by a young Hebrew captive, dreams of statues with golden heads and feet of clay, visions of kingdoms destined to rise and fall. Whether taken as prophecy or allegory, these tales underscore the aura of mystery that clung to Babylon, an aura that made it more than just a city. It became a symbol, a stage where divine will and human ambition collided. What makes Babylon so compelling is not only what we know, but what we cannot pin down. The city is both historical fact and shimmering legend. Archaeologists uncover bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, yet the gardens remain elusive. Texts describe rituals in honor of Marduk, yet myths speak of gods descending from the skies, the Anunnaki guiding kings and priests. Was Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon a human achievement of engineering, artistry, and governance, or was it, as some believe, touched by otherworldly influence? The question lingers like the dust that still covers its ruins. The Ishtar Gate itself tells a story of this ambiguity. Its brilliant blue tiles were decorated with dragons known as Mushushu, creatures associated with Marduk. To modern eyes, they are mythological symbols, composites of snake, lion, and eagle. To the Babylonians, they were guardians, manifestations of divine power. But some speculative voices suggest another layer. Were these images attempts to record beings actually encountered? Were they stylized memories of creatures from another realm, filtered through the artistry of ancient craftsmen? We cannot know. What we can say is that in Babylon, the lines between reality and symbol were never sharply drawn. To them, the world was alive with forces seen and unseen, and the city itself was a reflection of that truth. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon endured as the pinnacle of Mesopotamian civilization, yet even at its height, it carried the seeds of decline. Empires rose and fell in the Near East with relentless rhythm, each leaving ruins upon which the next would build. But Babylon's name lingered longer than most, etched into memory not only for its power, but for its mysteries. Travelers centuries later would still marvel at its scale, its myths carried into the stories of Greeks, Hebrews, Persians, and Romans alike. To them, Babylon was never just a city. It was an idea, a reminder of both the brilliance and the fragility of human endeavor. And within that idea lay the echo of something deeper. The Anunnaki, the laws from the sky, the knowledge of the stars, all these threads wove into a narrative that refuses to be silenced. Was Babylon simply the triumph of human imagination? Or was it, as some whisper, a collaboration between earthbound mortals and visitors from the heavens? The ruins do not answer. They sit silent in the desert, their bricks worn by time, their secrets buried beneath shifting sands. But as we stand before them in imagination, one truth emerges. Babylon was a place where humanity reached for the divine, and whether by our own hands or with help from beyond, it touched the heavens more closely than most civilizations ever dared. The brilliance of Babylon, like the brilliance of all empires, did not last forever. Even as Nebuchadnezzar's reign cast its glow across Mesopotamia, shadows gathered at the edges of his kingdom. The great city that had been fortified by walls, enriched by trade, and sanctified by ritual, was not immune to the shifting tides of power. After the king's death, his successors struggled to maintain the same authority. Intrigues at court, pressure from neighboring states, and the relentless march of new empires all conspired against Babylon. By the late 6th century BCE, the city that had once seemed eternal was entering its final act. The end came not with fire and devastation, but with something stranger, an almost bloodless conquest. In 539 BCE, the armies of Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire, approached Babylon. According to later accounts, the Persians diverted the Euphrates River, lowering its waters enough for soldiers to march along the riverbed beneath the city walls. The gates were said to have been left open, whether through treachery, exhaustion, or divine will. By dawn, the city that had withstood centuries of wars and sieges belonged to another ruler. Cyrus entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, at least in his own inscriptions. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, often called the First Declaration of Human Rights, proclaims that the Persian king restored order, respected the gods, and allowed exiled peoples to return home. To the Jews held in Babylonian captivity, this was fulfillment of prophecy, deliverance at the hands of a foreign king blessed by heaven. Yet even in its fall, Babylon did not lose its aura. Greek travelers who later visited the ruins described the city in tones of wonder. Herodotus wrote of its massive walls, its great river, its temples filled with statues. Though many of his accounts are exaggerated or uncertain, they show how Babylon continued to capture the imagination of outsiders long after its power waned. To the Greeks, it was both exotic and instructive, a place where the mysteries of the East unfolded in brick and stone. To the Hebrews, it became the symbol of exile, a city whose arrogance brought divine judgment. To the Persians, it was a jewel to be claimed and repurposed within their expanding empire. Each culture remade Babylon in its own image, transforming it into a mirror for hopes and fears alike. What makes Babylon's decline so haunting is how swiftly glory turned to silence. The great Ziggurat of Etemenanke, once believed to touch the heavens, began to crumble. Temples that had echoed with chants fell quiet. Markets that bustled with merchants grew still. Within a few centuries, the city that had once claimed the center of the world was abandoned, its bricks scattered by wind and rain, its walls reduced to mounds of clay. By the time Alexander the Great marched into Mesopotamia in the 4th century BCE, Babylon was already a ghost of itself. He dreamed of making it his capital, of restoring its temples. But his death ended the vision. Babylon slipped further into ruin, its name lingering while its streets disappeared. But names have power, and Babylon's name refused to die. In scripture and tradition, it transformed from a city into a symbol. In the Hebrew Bible, it was the land of exile, the place where psalms of longing were sung by the rivers. In Christian texts, it became the archetype of sin, the whore of Babylon in the book of Revelation, standing for decadence, corruption, and the ultimate downfall of human pride. In Islamic tradition, it carried echoes of sorcery and forbidden knowledge, tied to myths of angels bound in chains for teaching humans dangerous arts. Across centuries, Babylon endured not in stone, but in imagination, a warning, and a fascination. Few cities have lived so vividly after their physical death. The ruins themselves still hold an uncanny presence. Archaeologists who began excavations in the 19th century uncovered layers of mud brick walls, foundations of palaces, fragments of inscriptions. They pieced together the outlines of streets, the remains of the Ishtar Gate, the base of the great Ziggurat. Each discovery both clarified and deepened the mystery. The cuneiform tablets revealed extraordinary detail about administration, trade, and astronomy. Yet they also preserved the voices of myths that spoke of gods descending from the heavens. Standing amid the ruins, one cannot help but feel the double weight of history and legend pressing together. Babylon was real, and yet Babylon was also more than real. A place where human memory folded myth into fact until the two became inseparable. The fall of Babylon did not erase the sense that its people had touched knowledge beyond their age. The records of their mathematics, their law, their astronomy traveled outward, influencing Persians, Greeks, and countless others. Yet the stories of the Anunnaki, of divine teachers who once walked among mortals, lingered in the background like faint stars barely visible at night. Even in decline, Babylon seemed haunted by presences too vast to vanish with the fall of walls. The image of a tower stretching toward the sky remained, retold as the Tower of Babel, a monument of ambition cut short by divine intervention. Whether understood as historical ziggurat or cosmic allegory, it reinforced the idea that Babylon had dared to cross boundaries forbidden to humankind. Perhaps that is why the city's memory endured. Babylon was both a warning and a wonder. It showed how high humans could build, how far they could reach, and how swiftly it all could collapse. Empires that came after, Persian, Greek, Roman, looked back at Babylon as a reminder of impermanence. Yet the fascination never faded, because within its story lay not only the rise and fall of a city, but the enduring question of what role, if any, forces beyond human understanding had played in its destiny. Did the Babylonians simply push human ingenuity to its limits? Or did they, as their myths suggest, walk for a time alongside beings who descended from the stars? The ruins do not speak, but the questions they raise continue to echo. In the end, the fall of Babylon was not a single moment, but a long fading, a slow retreat into silence. And yet that silence is filled with resonance. To this day, when the name Babylon is spoken, it carries the weight of mystery. It evokes gardens that may never have existed, laws carved in stone by the hand of a god, and towers that stretched toward the heavens. It summons visions of a people who measured the stars with uncanny precision, who built monuments that defied their era, and who left behind stories that seemed to hint at more than human effort. Babylon fell, but Babylon also never truly died. It remains a riddle etched into history, daring us to listen to the whispers of its stones and to wonder whether its secrets are ours alone, or whether they came from somewhere far beyond the earth. The ruins of Babylon may have crumbled into silence, but the stories born there refused to vanish. They traveled along with exiles, merchants, and conquerors, carried across deserts and seas until they were woven into the sacred texts and mythologies of other peoples. Among these, none has resonated more deeply than the tale of the Tower of Babel. According to the book of Genesis, after the Great Flood, humanity spoke one language and dwelled together as a single people. In their unity, they decided to build a tower so high it would reach the heavens, a monument that would make their name eternal. But God, displeased with their pride, confused their speech, scattering them across the earth. The tower remained unfinished, and its ruins were said to stand in Babylon as a warning against ambition that sought to rival the divine. For generations, this story shaped how outsiders understood Babylon. To the Hebrews, it was not only a city of exile, but the place where human arrogance met divine judgment. To Christians, centuries later, it became a parable of pride, a symbol of how human endeavors collapse when they try to climb too far beyond their station. Yet to the Babylonians themselves, the Ziggurat was never an act of defiance. It was a bridge, a sacred ladder meant to bind earth to the heavens, a place where gods could descend and humans could ascend. The gulf between how the builders saw themselves and how later traditions remembered them is striking. In this tension lies a clue to why Babylon's myths endure. They speak differently depending on who tells them, revealing as much about the storyteller as about the city itself. The figure of Nimrod, named in the biblical account as the mighty hunter who ruled in Babylon, only deepened the sense of mystery. Some traditions depict him as a rebel king who led humanity in defiance of God, orchestrating the construction of the tower. Others suggest he was a cultural hero, a symbol of human ambition and mastery. Whether villain or visionary, Nimrod became inseparable from the image of Babylon, a human face placed upon the shadow of the Ziggurat. Over time, legends wrapped around him like vines around a ruined wall, blurring history and imagination until he became a cipher for power itself. In Jewish and Christian traditions, he is condemned. In other readings, he is a titan who dared what others feared. Always his name circles back to Babylon, reminding us how the city itself became a stage upon which myths were enacted. Beyond scripture, Babylon's influence stretched into the mythologies of surrounding lands. The Anunnaki, first named in Sumerian texts and carried into Babylonian tradition, became figures of fascination far beyond Mesopotamia. They were described as the children of Anu, the sky god, descending to earth to govern, to teach, and sometimes to judge. In clay tablets, they appear as both benevolent and fearsome, beings of immense knowledge who shaped the destinies of kings. Some stories cast them as guides who taught agriculture, mathematics, and astronomy. Others as miners who came to extract resources from the earth. Their forms were fluid, sometimes anthropomorphic, sometimes more abstract, sometimes radiant with divine light. Scholars today interpret these stories in many ways, as symbolic tales of natural forces, as personifications of royal power, or, in more speculative readings, as memories of contact with beings not of this world. Whatever the interpretation, their presence in the mythic imagination of Babylon is undeniable. They stand as reminders that for the Babylonians, the boundary between the human and the divine was thin, a permeable veil through which wisdom might pass. The idea that the Anunnaki gave laws to Hammurabi or knowledge of the stars to priests has become one of the most enduring points of fascination. If taken literally, it suggests a civilization that received its brilliance from teachers beyond our planet. If taken symbolically, it illustrates how deeply the Babylonians believed their achievements were sanctified by forces greater than themselves. Either way, the impression left is the same. Babylon was not just a city that built and traded, but a city that reached outward, upward, into the unknown. In this sense, the myth and the history converge. For whether by divine gift or human genius, Babylon's accomplishments in law, architecture, and astronomy remain extraordinary, too advanced to be easily dismissed as the product of chance. The legacy of Babylon's myths reached Greece, where philosophers and historians echoed tales of great towers, sacred laws, and star-watching priests. It reached Rome, where the idea of empire drew lessons from both the triumphs and the collapses of Babylon. It reached the deserts of Arabia, where echoes of Babylon's sorcery and forbidden knowledge entered Islamic tradition, shaping cautionary tales about arrogance and temptation. In every culture that touched its memory, Babylon became more than a place. It became an idea, a symbol malleable enough to serve different purposes, yet enduring enough never to fade. That is the strange fate of Babylon, to vanish as a city, but to persist as a story told and retold in every age. What remains most remarkable is how the myths and the ruins seem to speak to one another. Archaeologists dig clay tablets that describe star charts with mathematical precision, while legends tell of celestial beings teaching humanity the paths of the heavens. Inscriptions record Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god, receiving laws, while stories insist those laws were spoken by a radiant figure who descended from the skies. Ziggurats crumble into mounds of earth, while scripture remembers them as towers of ambition halted by divine decree. The physical and the mythic overlap, until it becomes difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. Perhaps this is why Babylon exerts such power on the imagination. It is neither wholly myth nor wholly history, but a weaving of both. To step into the memory of Babylon is to step into a liminal space, a threshold where human achievement meets the possibility of something greater. Whether we choose to see the Anunnaki as metaphors or as mysteries, whether we view the Tower of Babel as legend or as memory of an actual ziggurat, the effect is the same. Babylon draws us into questions larger than itself. Who are we, that we reach for the heavens? What knowledge lies beyond our grasp, waiting to be given or discovered? Why do we build monuments meant to last forever, knowing that time will eventually grind them into dust? These are not questions unique to Babylon, but in Babylon they find their most haunting expression. And so the myths live on. They live in the psalms sung in exile, in the scriptures that speak of towers and judgments, in the speculative theories of modern dreamers who imagine ancient visitors from the stars. They live in every retelling that casts Babylon as prideful empire, forbidden garden, or gateway to the gods. Each generation remakes Babylon, but none erases it. The city remains, not in brick and mortar, but in story, eternal in a way even Nebuchadnezzar could not have foreseen. For centuries, Babylon was little more than a name carried in scripture and legend, its walls and temples swallowed by sand and time. Travelers who passed through Mesopotamia in the Middle Ages described barren mounds rising from the plain, scattered fragments of brick inscribed with strange symbols, and villages built from ancient debris. They spoke of ruins haunted by serpents and demons, whispering that this was the cursed city once destroyed by divine wrath. To most of the world, Babylon was less a real place than a warning wrapped in myth, an emblem of human pride punished and forgotten. Yet beneath the dust, the city still waited, its memories sealed inside clay tablets buried deep in the earth. The Great Rediscovery began in the 19th century, an age when European explorers and archaeologists set their eyes on the lands of the Bible. Inspired by stories of Nebuchadnezzar, Hammurabi, and the Tower of Babel, expeditions from Britain, France, and Germany set out across Mesopotamia with spades and determination. Among them was Robert Koldewey, a German architect whose meticulous work would finally bring Babylon back into the light. Beginning in 1899, Koldewey led excavations at the site of Hilla, on the Euphrates south of Baghdad. There, after centuries of silence, the walls of Babylon began to rise again. Not in glory, but in fragments, foundations, and broken lines of brick. Slowly, methodically, Koldewey traced the outlines of palaces, temples, and streets, mapping the city described by ancient texts. What they found astonished the world. The Ishtar Gate, once a shimmering entryway of glazed blue brick, lay shattered but recoverable. Piece by piece, its fragments were shipped to Berlin, where the gate was reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum, restoring to modern eyes a vision of Babylonian grandeur. Reliefs of lions, bulls, and dragons marched once more along its walls, echoing the procession that had led citizens and kings into the heart of the city. To walk beneath it, even in a museum thousands of miles from Mesopotamia, was to feel the weight of a civilization long gone, yet strangely near. Equally transformative was the discovery of cuneiform tablets by the thousands. Dug from palace archives, temple storerooms, and buried libraries, these clay records opened a window into the daily life of Babylon. They contained contracts, receipts, astronomical observations, prayers, and myths. With the decipherment of cuneiform in the mid-19th century, scholars could at last read the voices of Babylon. The myths of Gilgamesh, the Code of Hammurabi, the star catalogues, and the rituals of the temples emerged from silence, altering forever how we understand the ancient world. Suddenly, Babylon was not only a cursed city from Scripture, but a living society whose thoughts and systems could still speak to us across millennia. And yet, with every discovery, the mystery deepened. The astronomical tablets revealed calculations of planetary movements that seemed astonishingly accurate, far surpassing what many believed possible for their time. The Plimpton 322 tablet, with its series of numbers forming what appear to be Pythagorean triples, hinted at mathematical knowledge centuries before Pythagoras. Scholars debated. Were the Babylonians simply gifted observers who refined their methods over generations? Or did their myths of knowledge descending from the gods contain some forgotten truth? The questions revived the whispers of the Anunnaki, the celestial beings who, according to Mesopotamian lore, had guided humanity in its earliest steps. To the cautious, these were only stories. To others, they were echoes of something extraordinary that the ruins could not fully conceal. The rediscovery of Babylon also reshaped the cultural imagination of the modern world. Writers and artists seized upon its image as the archetype of decadence and ruin. Painters depicted the fall of Babylon in sweeping scenes of fire and chaos. Poets invoked its name to symbolize corruption, temptation, and decline. At the same time, historians marveled at its achievements, reconstructing its streets and rituals in scholarly works that sought to separate fact from legend. Babylon became once more a mirror, sometimes reflecting human brilliance, sometimes human folly, always leaving the viewer unsettled. Even in the 20th century, Babylon's legacy refused to rest quietly. The site became a stage for politics as well as archaeology. Leaders in modern Iraq sought to claim its heritage, restoring parts of the ruins, rebuilding the walls with new bricks stamped with their own names beside that of Nebuchadnezzar. To walk there was to walk through layers of history, ancient foundations, colonial excavations, modern reconstructions, all stacked together like the strata of time itself. Babylon, once forgotten, was again a symbol of national pride, of continuity, of the ever-shifting meanings that people impose upon the past. For those who visit today, the ruins of Babylon are at once stark and stirring. The Euphrates still winds nearby, the plains stretch wide beneath a blazing sun, and the remnants of walls rise from the earth in jagged outlines. It takes imagination to see the bustling markets, the towering ziggurat, the gardens of legend. But imagination has always been part of Babylon's story. From the myths of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel to the theories of the Anunnaki, Babylon has always been more than its bricks. It is a canvas upon which humanity projects questions about power, knowledge, and the boundary between the human and the divine. What makes the rediscovery of Babylon so haunting is that even the archaeologists, with their careful methods and measurements, could not dispel the aura of mystery. Every tablet they unearthed, every wall they mapped, seemed to confirm both the brilliance of its people and the lingering strangeness of their accomplishments. The city remained a paradox, at once fully human and somehow more than human, a civilization whose achievements invite admiration but whose myths refuse to be silenced. Babylon re-emerged not only as a place in history, but as a symbol for all time. Proof that even when a city falls, its stories can make it immortal. And so the excavations of the 19th and 20th centuries did not close the book on Babylon. They opened it wider. They revealed a city of merchants, priests, astronomers, kings, and dreamers. They confirmed its laws, its rituals, its architecture. But they also left space for speculation, for wonder, for the possibility that behind the precision of its tablets and the grandeur of its monuments lay something we still do not fully understand. Babylon is history, and Babylon is legend. Its rediscovery only reminded us that the two are never as far apart as we think. When we look at Babylon, not through the eyes of myth, but through the lens of its surviving records, what emerges is a civilization astonishing in its intellectual reach. In clay tablets hardened by fire and buried for millennia, the Babylonians preserved a knowledge of numbers and stars that continues to astonish modern scholars. These fragments of ancient thought reveal not only a society skilled in trade and agriculture, but one that sought to understand the universe itself with remarkable precision. The cuneiform tablets that speak of astronomy are among the most striking. They record the movement of the moon, the paths of planets, and the rising and setting of constellations with a level of detail that feels almost modern. Night after night, priests and scribes climbed the ziggurats, watching the skies above the flat Mesopotamian plains. Their records tracked eclipses, predicted the cycles of Venus, and noted the positions of Jupiter and Saturn. They saw the heavens as both a divine text and a scientific field, where gods spoke through celestial patterns, but where careful observation also revealed reliable cycles. In their eyes, the two were never separate. The spiritual and the empirical were woven together into one system of meaning. Among the most famous of these astronomical texts are the so-called Babylonian star catalogues. Discovered in the 19th century near the ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, these tablets describe constellations that we still recognize today. The signs of the zodiac, familiar to modern astrologers and casual readers of horoscopes, trace their lineage directly back to these ancient records. Aries, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio. These were first marked and named in the skies of Mesopotamia. The Babylonians divided the sky into 12 sections, each corresponding to a lunar month, forming a structure that influenced not only astrology, but also the very calendars by which civilizations organized their lives. That this system spread to the Greeks and Romans, and eventually into the modern world, speaks to the enduring power of Babylon's observations. But astronomy was not only about divination, it was also about mathematics. To record the heavens, the Babylonians developed a base 60, or sexagesimal, number system. This system allowed them to divide circles into 360 degrees and hours into 60 minutes, conventions we still use today. On clay tablets, such as Plimpton 322, we find evidence of mathematical sophistication that predates Greek geometry by more than a millennium. The tablet, inscribed around 1800 BCE, lists sets of numbers that correspond to what we call Pythagorean triples, whole number sets that satisfy the Pythagorean theorem of right triangles. This discovery stunned 20th century scholars, for it suggested that the Babylonians not only understood basic geometry, but had formalized it long before Pythagoras. Were they solving practical problems of land division and construction, or had they reached deeper into abstract mathematics? The question remains open, but the evidence speaks clearly. Babylon was a society where mathematics thrived at a level far beyond simple counting. Consider what it must have felt like to live in a world where every harvest, every flood, every eclipse carried both practical and mystical meaning. The Babylonians calculated to predict, but they also interpreted to understand. When Venus appeared brightly in the evening sky, it was not only an astronomical event, but a message from Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. When an eclipse darkened the sun, it was both a calculable cycle and a warning of upheaval. This blending of science and myth created a worldview where numbers did not strip the world of meaning, but added to it, reinforcing the idea that human life was intertwined with the cosmos. It is easy for us today to separate science from spirituality, but in Babylon, they were inseparable. The astronomer was also a priest. The calculation was also a prophecy. In their fusion lies part of the enduring allure of Babylon. For modern science owes much to their methods, their use of systematic observation, their reliance on recorded data, their mathematical tables. Yet their worldview reminds us that knowledge was never divorced from wonder. They did not study the stars to reduce them to abstractions, but to listen to their voices. What is remarkable is how far their influence spread. The Greeks, inheriting Babylonian astronomy through contact with Mesopotamia and Persia, transformed it into the foundations of Western science. Hipparchus and Ptolemy built on Babylonian star charts, refining them into models of the cosmos. The division of the circle into 360 degrees, the use of hours and minutes, the very structure of trigonometry, all bear Babylon's imprint. Even as cultures changed and empires shifted, the logic of Babylonian mathematics endured, quietly guiding humanity's journey into modern science. And yet, the question lingers: How did a Bronze Age people achieve such sophistication? Some argue that centuries of meticulous observation naturally led to these insights, that with enough time and patience, the cycles of the heavens reveal themselves. Others point to the myths of the Anunnaki, suggesting that the Babylonians themselves believed their knowledge had been gifted by beings from the sky. To them, wisdom was not only earned but bestowed, handed down by those who crossed the boundary between the stars and the earth. Whether this was metaphor or memory, we cannot know. But it reveals how the Babylonians themselves understood their achievements, not as isolated human inventions, but as part of a larger cosmic order in which they participated. To modern eyes, the survival of these tablets is itself miraculous. Baked in fire, abandoned, buried, and forgotten, they endured long after Babylon fell, waiting to be uncovered by archaeologists who could read their wedge-shaped signs. They remind us that knowledge can survive collapse, that ideas can outlast the walls that once housed them. Babylon may have fallen to Cyrus, its ziggurats crumbled, its gardens vanished, but its mathematics and astronomy remained, carried forward in clay until they could reawaken centuries later. To imagine a Babylonian priest, stylus in hand, etching numbers into wet clay under the glow of an oil lamp, is to glimpse the timelessness of curiosity. He could not have known that his calculations would survive thousands of years, that they would be studied in universities and museums across a world he could not imagine. He worked to serve his temple, his king, his gods, yet his work became part of humanity's shared inheritance. That is the paradox of Babylon, a city that vanished, yet a mind that endures. The stars they mapped are still above us. The numbers they wrote still shape our clocks, our compasses, our maps. Every time we divide an hour into 60 minutes or a circle into 360 degrees, we echo the legacy of Babylon. In this way, the city that fell remains with us, its science woven into the fabric of modern life. It is a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, but knowledge, once discovered, has the power to leap across ages, carried by clay, memory, and the stubborn persistence of human curiosity. If there was one force that shaped Babylon beyond its walls and palaces, it was religion. To live in the city was to inhabit a landscape where every action, from sowing seeds in the field to marching in a royal procession, carried a sacred dimension. The gods were not distant abstractions, but immediate presences woven into the fabric of daily life. Temples dotted the city like beating hearts, each one a dwelling place for a particular deity. Priests and priestesses tended to these sanctuaries with rituals as precise as mathematics, rituals that gave the city its rhythm. Festivals and ceremonies brought the people together in collective devotion, reminding them that their prosperity and survival depended not only on their labor but on the favor of powers greater than themselves. At the center of Babylon's religious life stood Marduk, the city's patron deity. His story, preserved in the Babylonian creation epic known as the Enuma Elish, recounts how he rose to supremacy among the gods by defeating the primordial chaos represented by the dragon Tiamat. With her body, he shaped the heavens and the earth, bringing order to a universe of turmoil. It was no accident that Babylon, the city dedicated to Marduk, saw itself as the center of order on earth, a reflection of cosmic stability. The king was his chosen servant, the earthly steward of divine law, and the temples were the sites where heaven and earth touched. The New Year festival, called the Akitu, embodied this cosmic drama. Each spring, as the rivers swelled and the fields promised new growth, Babylon erupted in celebration. For days the city was transformed into a theater of ritual. Statues of the gods were carried from their temples in solemn processions, moving through the processional way beneath the shining Ishtar Gate. Crowds lined the streets, singing hymns, scattering flowers, and cheering as the divine images passed. In these moments, the gods did not simply dwell in their sanctuaries. They walked among their people, carried on the shoulders of priests, but alive in the minds of every onlooker. The climax of the festival came in the Temple of Marduk. Here, the king himself took part in a ritual of profound humility. Stripped of his regalia, he entered the holy space where the high priest awaited. There, before the statue of Marduk, the king confessed his failures, acknowledging his human weakness. The priest struck him, a symbolic gesture meant to strip away arrogance and remind him of his dependence on divine authority. If tears welled in the king's eyes, a sign of sincerity, then it was taken as a good omen. In that moment, the king's rule was renewed, sanctioned not by his armies or wealth, but by the will of the god. The ceremony bound the fate of the city to the fate of the king, ensuring that both remained under the protection of Marduk for another year. Rituals of fertility and sacred marriage also held central importance. The goddess Ishtar, embodying both love and war, presided over ceremonies in which the king, or sometimes a high priest, enacted a symbolic union with her priestess. This rite, performed at the new year or other key moments, represented the harmony between heaven and earth, ensuring fertility for the land and prosperity for the people. In the union of God and human, the Babylonians saw the promise of abundance, the renewal of life itself. These rites remind us that for Babylon, religion was not a compartment of existence, but a force that permeated everything. The fields, the markets, the throne room, the household. Even the architecture of the city reflected this religious integration. The Ziggurat et Anunnaki, the foundation of heaven and earth, was not just a massive structure of mud brick, but a cosmic symbol. Each level represented a layer of the universe, ascending from the earthly to the celestial. Climbing its steps was itself an act of devotion, a physical movement toward the realm of the gods. To the Babylonians, it was a ladder binding them to the heavens, a place where priests could perform rituals that ensured balance between the seen and unseen worlds. Later traditions transformed this image into the story of the Tower of Babel, interpreting it as defiance rather than devotion. Yet to the Babylonians, it was sacred alignment, a structure that embodied their vision of a universe ordered by divine law. Babylonian divination also reveals how seriously they took the signs of the gods. Priests studied the livers of sacrificial animals, seeking patterns that revealed divine will. They interpreted dreams, casting them as messages from the unseen. They read the movements of the stars as omens of war, peace, or famine. To us, these may seem like fragments of superstition, but for the Babylonians, they were methods of understanding the language of the cosmos. If the gods communicated through signs, then it was the duty of humanity to listen carefully. By reading the heavens, they sought to align human action with divine intention, avoiding disaster and securing prosperity. Law, too, was infused with religion. The Code of Hammurabi was more than a legal text. It was a sacred covenant. Its opening lines describe the king as chosen by Shamash, the sun god of justice, to establish fairness and protect the weak. Every verdict, every decree, was not only a social necessity but a religious duty. Justice was seen as divine balance, and to violate it was to disturb the order of the universe. In this way, law and worship were not separate realms, but complementary expressions of the same truth: that human society must mirror the order of the cosmos. When we step back, what emerges is a vision of Babylon as a city where everything was ritualized, everything connected to the gods. The people did not see their world as divided into sacred and secular, but as one seamless whole. Agriculture was sustained by offerings to fertility deities. Commerce was protected by rituals in the temples. Kingship was legitimized by divine sanction. Even the movements of the stars were read as messages from celestial beings. In such a world, the distinction between human effort and divine guidance blurred. Every brick laid, every contract signed, every star observed was part of a larger pattern, a dialogue between humanity and the gods. And yet, within this worldview, the lingering mystery of the Anunnaki remained. These beings, described as children of the sky god Anu, were said to have descended to Earth to guide and sometimes to judge. They existed both within and beyond the pantheon, enigmatic figures whose presence suggested a deeper layer of meaning. To the Babylonians, they might have represented the ultimate source of wisdom, the original givers of law and science. To us, they remain puzzles. Were they symbols, metaphors, or memories of something stranger? Whatever the answer, their place in Babylon's mythology reminds us that the city's religion was not static, but dynamic, a living system that absorbed wonder and speculation as naturally as it did ritual precision. In Babylon's rituals, we glimpse not only the faith of a people, but their attempt to harmonize with a universe they believed was alive with meaning. Their ceremonies tied the fate of the city to the rhythm of the cosmos, ensuring that humanity's fragile existence was aligned with forces larger than itself. Whether we view their gods as metaphors, their rituals as theater, or their divination as primitive science, the effect is the same. Babylon emerges as a civilization that never stopped reaching toward the divine, believing that in every star, every law, every ritual, the voice of heaven could still be heard. Kingship in Babylon was never just about governance. It was theater, ritual, and divine mandate rolled into one, a role that demanded not only military strength and administrative skill, but also the ability to embody the will of the gods. A Babylonian king could not simply be a ruler. He was the bridge between heaven and earth, the guardian of justice, the chosen of Marduk, Shamash, or Ishtar. Every decree he issued, every temple he rebuilt, every war he fought was cast as an extension of divine order, ensuring that the fragile world of humans did not slip into chaos. Hammurabi, who reigned in the 18th century BCE, remains the archetype of this fusion of power and piety. His code of laws, carved into the stele of black diorite that still stands in the Louvre, was framed not as a human invention, but as a revelation. The carving shows the king standing before Shamash, the radiant sun god, who hands him the rod and ring of authority. Beneath that image stretch nearly 300 laws, covering matters from property disputes to marriage contracts, wages, debts, and crimes. But their true power lay in their presentation. They were not Hammurabi's personal dictates. They were the embodiment of cosmic justice. To obey the law was to live in harmony with the gods. To defy it was to disrupt the balance of the universe. Hammurabi thus positioned himself not as a tyrant, but as a servant of the divine, whose duty was to shield the weak from the strong and preserve order in a world always threatened by disorder. Centuries later, Nebuchadnezzar II carried this legacy forward in his own way. His inscriptions often begin with declarations of devotion to Marduk, portraying his massive building projects as acts of worship rather than displays of personal ambition. He rebuilt the great Ziggurat at Anunnaki, describing it as a dwelling for the gods, a cosmic foundation that anchored heaven and earth. He restored temples, raised the glittering Ishtar Gate, and expanded the city into a metropolis that awed all who entered. To him, architecture was not merely civic but sacred. Every brick stamped with his name was also stamped with divine approval. To look upon Babylon was to see the reflection of Marduk's order, made visible through the hands of his chosen king. But kingship was more than building and law. It was ritual. The Akitu festival each spring placed the king at the heart of a drama that reaffirmed his right to rule. When he stood before the high priest, stripped of crown and scepter, confessing his limitations, he became a symbol of humanity itself, flawed, fragile, dependent on higher power. When the priest struck him and drew tears from his eyes, it was not humiliation, but renewal. Those tears were signs that the king remained human enough to serve the gods, that his authority was not pride, but submission. Only then was his rule confirmed for another year. In that moment, political power was not maintained by armies or wealth, but by ritual acknowledgement of divine supremacy. The king's authority flowed not from his throne, but from the heavens. This intertwining of religion and politics gave Babylon remarkable cohesion. It bound together diverse peoples, languages, and trades under a single framework of meaning. The farmer in the fields, the merchant in the marketplace, the priest in the temple, and the soldier on the walls all understood themselves as participants in a larger order maintained by the king. The very act of paying taxes or obeying contracts carried sacred weight, for these were not just civic duties but contributions to the balance of the cosmos. In this way, the kings of Babylon wielded power that was both practical and symbolic, grounding their authority in a system that reached far beyond human institutions. Yet kingship was also fraught with danger. A ruler who failed to uphold justice, who neglected the gods, or who allowed chaos to spread, could quickly lose legitimacy. The same divine framework that supported the king could also condemn him. Ancient chronicles tell of rulers overthrown not only by rival armies, but by the judgment of priests who declared that the gods had withdrawn their favor. The Babylonians lived in a world where kingship was conditional, always dependent on maintaining harmony with the divine. This made the position both exalted and precarious, a role of immense honor, but also immense responsibility. The kings themselves understood this fragility, which is why they left behind inscriptions that endlessly proclaimed their piety. Nebuchadnezzar's texts often repeat his devotion to Marduk, framing his military victories and construction projects as acts of service to the god. Hammurabi's code opens with a declaration that he was chosen by Shamash to bring light to the land. Even lesser-known kings echoed these themes, carving their names into bricks alongside prayers and dedicatory formulas. The physical fabric of Babylon thus became a library of devotion, its very stones inscribed with the claim that the city's rulers acted on behalf of heaven. This model of kingship influenced not only Mesopotamia, but also surrounding cultures. The Persians, who conquered Babylon, adopted similar language of divine mandate. The Greeks, though more skeptical, still absorbed the idea that rulers could be seen as chosen by gods or fates. Later traditions, both religious and political, carried forward the notion that authority must rest on something beyond mere force. The echoes of Babylonian kingship can still be heard in concepts like the divine right of kings in medieval Europe, or in the idea of rulers as guardians of justice in modern states. Babylon's kings may be long gone, but the framework they embodied has never entirely disappeared. At the heart of it all lies the question: did the Babylonians truly believe their kings were chosen by gods, or was this a carefully constructed ideology to maintain control? The answer, perhaps, is both. For the Babylonians, belief and politics were not separate categories. To them, the king's power could not exist without divine sanction, and divine sanction could not manifest without the king's actions. In their worldview, the two were inseparable, reflections of the same truth. And if myths of the Anunnaki lingered in the background, suggesting that wisdom itself came from beings who descended from the skies, then kingship was not only a human institution, but a cosmic arrangement, part of a pattern that stretched beyond the earth itself. Standing amid the ruins today, it is easy to forget how much of Babylon's life revolved around its kings, but the stones still bear their marks. The bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, the stele carved with Hammurabi's laws, the fragments of temples rebuilt and rebuilt again, all speak of rulers who saw themselves not as individuals, but as instruments of something larger. Whether we interpret that as divine inspiration or political theater, the result was the same: a civilization where kingship fused human ambition with cosmic meaning, creating a legacy that would echo long after the city itself fell. To understand Babylon fully, we must see it not only as a city of temples and kings, but as a crossroads of the ancient world. The city's position along the Euphrates made it a hub for trade routes that connected the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, Anatolia to the Arabian deserts, and the Iranian plateau to the Levant. Goods, languages, and ideas flowed through its gates, carried on the backs of camels, donkeys, and riverboats. It was here that spices from Arabia mingled with tin from Anatolia, that lapis lazuli from Afghanistan was set into ornaments alongside cedar from Lebanon and linen from Egypt. Babylon was not isolated. It was porous, a marketplace where cultures met and reshaped one another in the steady churn of commerce and conversation. The city's markets were said to be vast and teeming, filled with stalls that offered goods both ordinary and exotic. One might purchase grain harvested from the surrounding plains, wool spun into fine garments, or dates pressed into syrupy cakes. At another stall, one could find ivory from distant Africa, incense from Yemen, or bronze tools forged in Anatolia. Each item carried with it a story of distant lands, and in each exchange Babylon grew richer not only in wealth, but in knowledge. Traders brought with them not only cargo, but tales, songs, and beliefs, weaving Babylon into the cultural fabric of a region that stretched far beyond Mesopotamia. This diversity extended into the population itself. Babylon was home to people from across the Near East, Akkadians, Arameans, Chaldeans, Persians, Jews, and Greeks in later centuries. Languages overlapped in the streets. Scribes recorded contracts in multiple tongues. Travelers shared news in caravanserais, where strangers became neighbors for a night. It was a city where no single identity could fully contain its essence, where the blending of cultures created something uniquely Babylonian. In this mingling, we glimpse both the strength and fragility of the city. Its openness made it vibrant and dynamic, but it also made it a target for conquerors who sought to control the flow of trade and the prestige of such a cosmopolitan center. Religious life, too, bore the mark of this diversity. The pantheon of Babylon was vast, absorbing deities from surrounding regions and blending them into its own system. Marduk rose as supreme, but Ishtar, Shamash, Ea, and others carried echoes of earlier Sumerian gods and neighboring traditions. Foreign cults found places within the city, their rituals adapted and integrated into Babylon's grand religious mosaic. This syncretism made Babylon not only a religious center, but also a melting pot of mythologies, where stories of creation, destruction, and divine order were retold in ever-changing forms. It is no wonder that later traditions, from Hebrew scripture to Greek philosophy, found fertile ground in Babylon, drawing on its vast reservoir of ideas even as they reshaped them for their own purposes. The city's role as a cultural crossroads also gave rise to one of its most enduring symbols, language itself. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel, with its tale of a single language fractured into many, reflects the reality that Babylon was a place where languages collided and multiplied. For the exiles and foreigners who walked its streets, the sound of unfamiliar tongues must have been overwhelming, a constant reminder that Babylon was not one people, but many. To later generations, this cacophony became a symbol of confusion. But within Babylon, it was simply life, a polyphonic chorus that filled the air with the sound of human variety. Commerce and culture shaped not only the economy, but also the intellectual life of the city. Babylon scholars were not cloistered in isolation. They absorbed influences from afar and shared their own discoveries outward. Astronomy, mathematics, law, and medicine all developed in dialogue with neighboring traditions. Tablets discovered in Babylon contain not only original insights, but also translations and adaptations of works from Sumer, Akkad, and beyond. This openness allowed Babylon to serve as a transmitter of knowledge, a conduit through which ideas flowed to later civilizations. In many ways, Babylon was less a solitary genius than a gathering place for the wisdom of the ancient world, refining and expanding what others had begun. Yet with this openness came tension. For those conquered and brought to Babylon, the city could feel like a prison. The Hebrew Psalms speak of exiles who wept by the rivers of Babylon, longing for Jerusalem, forced to sing songs of home in a foreign land. For them, the diversity of Babylon was not a source of wonder, but of displacement, a reminder that their culture was swallowed by a larger, alien whole. This duality, Babylon as both beacon and captor, gave the city its ambiguous legacy, celebrated by some as a marvel and condemned by others as a menace. Its cosmopolitanism could be seen as richness or as corruption, depending on where one stood. What strikes us today is how modern Babylon seems in this regard. The mixing of peoples, the blending of traditions, the constant negotiation between unity and diversity, All these are challenges that cities still face. Babylon shows us that cosmopolitanism is not new. It is as ancient as the first empires, as enduring as the first great marketplaces. The questions it raised, how to govern diversity, how to preserve identity in the midst of change, how to balance openness with stability, are questions that echo into our present with undiminished force. And as always, layered atop the human reality were the myths. To many, Babylon's wealth and diversity seemed almost unnatural, as if sustained by more than human effort. The Anunnaki, the gods from the skies, hovered in the imagination as possible patrons of this extraordinary city. How else, some wondered, could a single place gather so much knowledge, so much beauty, so much power? Whether taken literally or metaphorically, the idea reflects a truth. Babylon was not ordinary. It was a place that seemed to exceed itself, a city larger than life, embodying both the potential and the peril of human civilization. Walking through its ruins now, one can still imagine the voices of traders bargaining in half a dozen languages, the scent of spices from distant lands mingling with the smoke of temple incense, the sound of hymns rising beside the cries of merchants. Babylon was alive with diversity, a mosaic of cultures bound together by walls of mud brick and by the vision of kings who sought to make it the center of the world. That vision did not last, but its memory remains, a reminder that in diversity lies both strength and vulnerability, both brilliance and fragility. When we speak of Babylon's legacy, we cannot ignore the profound impact it had on one particular people, the exiled community of Judah. In 586 BCE, after a long struggle marked by rebellion and resistance, King Nebuchadnezzar II led his armies against Jerusalem. The city fell, its walls breached, its temple burned, its treasures looted. Many of its inhabitants were taken captive and marched eastward into Babylon. For the people of Judah, this was more than military defeat. It was a theological crisis. The temple, believed to be the dwelling place of their God, had been destroyed. The covenant they thought unbreakable seemed shattered. In exile by the rivers of Babylon, they wept, sang laments, and wrestled with questions of identity, faith, and destiny. The Book of Psalms preserves this anguish. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. These words, echoing across millennia, capture the pain of displacement. The captives were asked to sing the songs of their homeland, but their harps hung silent on the trees. For them, Babylon was both a physical place of exile and a symbol of despair, the embodiment of foreign power and divine judgment. Yet it was in this crucible of suffering that a new phase of Jewish identity emerged. Cut off from their temple, the exiles turned inward, deepening their devotion to the Torah, reinterpreting their history, and reimagining their relationship with God. Babylon became the setting for reflection and renewal. Prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah spoke to the exiles, urging them not to despair, but to see meaning in their displacement. Ezekiel, by the Chebar Canal, experienced visions of heavenly chariots and wheels within wheels, symbols of a God who was not bound to Jerusalem alone, but present even in foreign lands. Jeremiah wrote letters to the captives, advising them to plant gardens, build houses, and seek the welfare of the city where they now lived. Though exiled, they were not abandoned. The exile was reframed as both punishment and promise, a period of trial that would eventually lead to restoration. This reinterpretation of suffering reshaped the trajectory of Judaism, Without a temple, the focus shifted to scripture, prayer, and community. The synagogue, which would become central to Jewish life in later centuries, traces part of its origin to this period, when communal worship in exile replaced sacrifice at the temple. The trauma of Babylon forced a re-evaluation of identity, making the people of Judah less tied to place and more bound to covenant. Ironically, what seemed like destruction became a foundation for resilience. The very exile meant to dissolve them instead deepened their cohesion. The influence of Babylonian culture also left its mark. In the libraries and temples of Babylon, the exiles encountered myths and stories that bore striking resemblances to their own. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, spoke of chaos subdued by divine order, a theme not unlike the Hebrew account of Genesis. The story of a great flood preserved in Mesopotamian texts resonated with their own narrative of Noah. These parallels may have reinforced their sense of shared human heritage while sharpening their own distinct identity. In response, Jewish scribes crafted their scriptures with renewed urgency, recording traditions that had once been oral, preserving them against the risk of being forgotten in a foreign land. The exile, therefore, not only changed their theology, but also accelerated the formation of the Hebrew Bible as we know it. For the Babylonians, the exiles were but one group among many within their diverse empire. For the exiles themselves, Babylon loomed as both captor and catalyst. The grandeur of its temples, the precision of its laws, the brilliance of its astronomy, all of these must have impressed and intimidated those who came from the smaller, war-torn kingdom of Judah. Yet they held fast to their identity, finding strength in distinction. To them, Babylon's gods were idols, its rituals empty, its power temporary. Their God, though seemingly defeated, remained supreme, and in time would bring them home. This tension between awe and rejection defined their experience, giving rise to the enduring ambivalence with which Babylon would be remembered. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, the exiles saw their deliverance. The Persian king issued decrees allowing captive peoples to return to their homelands, rebuild their temples, and restore their practices. For the Jews, this was nothing short of divine intervention, a fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah even referred to Cyrus as God's anointed, a startling acknowledgement of a foreign ruler as instrument of deliverance. The return to Jerusalem marked the end of the exile, but Babylon's shadow lingered. In Scripture, Babylon remained a symbol of arrogance, excess, and oppression, destined to fall under divine judgment. This symbolic Babylon lived on long after the city itself declined. In the New Testament, Babylon reappears as a metaphor for Rome, the great empire that oppressed the early Christians. In the book of Revelation, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and abominations of the earth, becomes the archetype of worldly corruption doomed to destruction. By this time, Babylon's physical walls had long crumbled, but its name carried a weight far heavier than brick and mortar. It became shorthand for any power that exalted itself above God, any empire that sought to dominate through pride and cruelty. In this sense, Babylon transcended history to become a symbol woven into the moral imagination of the West. And yet, the exile also left a quieter legacy. In Babylon itself, Jewish communities continued to live and thrive even after the return to Jerusalem. Centuries later, in the early centuries of the Common Era, the Babylonian Talmud would be compiled, one of the most important works of Rabbinic Judaism. That a central text of Jewish tradition emerged not in Jerusalem, but in Babylon, speaks to the enduring bond forged in exile. What began as trauma became transformation, embedding Babylon forever in the story of a people who survived empire after empire without losing themselves. Babylon, then, was both oppressor and teacher, captor and catalyst. It inflicted pain but also provoked resilience, scattering but also preserving. To the exiles, it was the place where identity was tested and ultimately strengthened. To their descendants, it became a symbol of what must be resisted: arrogance, excess, and idolatry. In the broader history of religion, Babylon endures as both warning and paradox, a reminder that sometimes the deepest growth arises from the harshest exile. Its rivers may have once carried the songs of captives, but its memory carries the resilience of those who refused to be erased. By the time the Greeks rose to power, Babylon was already a city of memory as much as reality. Its walls still stood, its temples still cast shadows across the plain, but its glory had begun to fade. Yet, in the eyes of Greek travelers, soldiers, and historians, Babylon was no less extraordinary. To them it was a place where myth and history collided, where stories of gods, kings, and wonders seemed to rise directly from the soil. It became a mirror in which the Greeks saw both the marvels of the East and the dangers of empire. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote of Babylon in the 5th century BCE. His descriptions, though often colored by exaggeration, testify to the city's enduring aura. He spoke of its massive walls, so wide that 4-horse chariots could race upon them. He described the Euphrates dividing the city, crossed by bridges that connected its two halves. He marveled at its markets, its temples, and its organization. Yet his accounts also painted Babylon as a place of strange customs and exotic practices, a city that seemed both wondrous and alien. For Herodotus, Babylon represented the mystery of the East, impressive, but somehow unsettling in its difference from the Greek world. Later, writers repeated and reshaped these impressions. Ctesias, a Greek physician who served at the Persian court, told tales of Babylon filled with embellishment and myth. He spoke of walls stretching 50 miles, of towers gleaming with gold, of gardens suspended in the air. These accounts, passed down through generations, fed the Western imagination with images of splendor almost too great to believe. Whether accurate or not, they ensured that Babylon would live on in memory as a wonder of the world, its name synonymous with magnificence. At the same time, these tales often carried undertones of excess, suggesting that such grandeur was as much a warning as an achievement. The Hanging Gardens in particular fascinated Greek and later Roman writers. To them, the idea of a garden rising in terraces above the city, watered by hidden machines, seemed almost magical. Strabo and Diodorus Siculus described them in detail, though no definitive evidence has ever been found. For the Greeks, they were less interested in archaeological accuracy than in the symbolism of such a marvel. The gardens became a metaphor for the ingenuity and perhaps the arrogance of human ambition. Whether Nebuchadnezzar truly built them or whether they were imagined, they cemented Babylon's reputation as a city of wonders balanced precariously on the edge of hubris. When Alexander the Great marched into Mesopotamia In the 4th century BCE, Babylon became more than a distant tale. For him and his companions, it was a reality, a city whose ruins and surviving monuments testified to its former greatness. Alexander reportedly intended to make Babylon the capital of his vast empire, a center that could unite East and West. He admired its temples, ordered repairs to its ziggurats, and envisioned a city reborn under his rule. Yet fate intervened. In 323 BCE, after a campaign that stretched from Greece to India, Alexander fell ill in Babylon and died within its walls. To his followers, this seemed more than coincidence. The city that had symbolized both wonder and curse had claimed the greatest conqueror of the age. Babylon thus became enshrined not only in Greek imagination, but in the mythology of empire itself, a reminder that even the mightiest are mortal. The Romans inherited these stories and reframed them in their own terms. To Roman authors, Babylon epitomized the East, opulent, dangerous, alluring, and decadent. It was often portrayed as a cautionary tale, an example of how wealth and luxury could undermine strength. Roman poets invoked Babylon as a symbol of excess, a place where gold and desire corrupted all who entered. In their rhetoric, Rome was often contrasted with Babylon, the disciplined West against the decadent East. And yet, Rome could not resist Babylon's allure. Its myths seeped into Roman thought, influencing architecture, art, and literature. The city was condemned and admired in the same breath, despised as corrupt, yet envied as magnificent. This dual image, Babylon as marvel and Babylon as menace, persisted throughout classical antiquity. Philosophers used it as an example of impermanence, a reminder that even the grandest civilizations fall. Historians treated it as a lesson in the dangers of pride and ambition. Artists and poets turned it into a backdrop for tales of love, betrayal, and hubris. Babylon was no longer a living empire, but an idea, a symbol flexible enough to carry whatever meaning each generation required. The fascination with Babylon also reflected deeper questions within Greek and Roman culture. What made civilizations rise and fall? Was power sustained by virtue or undone by luxury? Could human ambition build structures that rivaled the gods, or did such attempts always end in ruin? Babylon embodied these questions. Its ziggurats, its laws, its myths, and its fall became reference points in an ongoing meditation on the fate of empires. In looking at Babylon, the Greeks and Romans were also looking at themselves, seeing both their aspirations and their anxieties reflected in its story. Even in decline, Babylon shaped the way later civilizations thought about the relationship between power and morality. The Greeks saw in it both a wonder to admire and a rival to surpass. The Romans used it as a foil against which to define their own identity, even as they echoed its grandeur in their architecture and administration. Both cultures ensured that Babylon would not vanish into the sands, but remain alive in the imagination, not merely as ruins on the Euphrates, but as a universal symbol of human ambition and its consequences. And so, long after its temples crumbled and its palaces turned to dust, Babylon lived on in the words of Herodotus, Ctesias, Strabo, Diodorus, and countless others. It became a story retold in classrooms, marketplaces, and palaces, a story that continued to shape how the West understood the East, how empires understood themselves, and how humanity reflected on its own capacity for greatness and folly. The city had become eternal, not in bricks and mortar, but in myth and memory. As centuries passed, and Babylon's walls sank deeper into the earth, its reputation in human imagination took on a darker, more mysterious cast. No longer merely a fallen city of kings, Babylon came to symbolize a place of secret wisdom, of forbidden rites, of arcane practices whispered about in temples and back alleys. To medieval chroniclers, to mystics, and later to occultists, Babylon was not only history, but a repository of hidden knowledge, both feared and desired. This transformation did not happen all at once, but emerged gradually as the fragments of Babylonian culture were woven into the stories and beliefs of later civilizations. Central to this image was astrology. The Babylonians' careful records of the heavens, originally crafted as a mixture of astronomy and divine interpretation, were remembered in later centuries as the root of astrological practice itself. To them, the stars were signs placed in the sky by the gods, messages that, if properly read, could reveal the shape of destiny. When their tablets were translated by Greeks and later absorbed by Romans, the art of horoscopy, the reading of one's fate from the alignment of the heavens at birth, spread across the Mediterranean world. By the Middle Ages, astrology was inseparable from the image of Babylon. To say that one practiced the art of the Chaldeans was to say that one read the stars, for Chaldean became synonymous with astrologer. In this way, Babylon's priests were recast in the imagination of Europe as ancient magicians, keepers of secrets too potent for common hands. Magic, too, was linked to Babylon in popular lore. The Bible itself contributed to this image. In the book of Daniel, Babylon's court is filled with magicians, enchanters, and sorcerers called upon to interpret dreams and omens. They fail where Daniel succeeds, but their presence cements the association of Babylon with forbidden arts. Later, Jewish and Christian writings expanded this idea, portraying Babylon as a place where angels once revealed hidden knowledge to humankind, knowledge that became corrupted into sorcery. The apocryphal Book of Enoch describes angels who descended to earth, teaching metallurgy, charms, and astrology before being bound in punishment. Though not explicitly tied to Babylon, these stories resonated with the city's reputation, reinforcing the idea that Mesopotamia was the cradle not only of civilization, but of dangerous wisdom. In Islamic tradition, echoes of this same theme appear. The Quran speaks of Harut and Marut, two angels sent down to Babylon who taught people magic as a test, warning them not to misuse it. Despite their warnings, the people embraced the knowledge, and the angels were punished, suspended upside down in chains. This tale, deeply embedded in Islamic lore, further cemented Babylon's identity as a place where heavenly beings descended, where esoteric knowledge passed into human hands, and where temptation proved irresistible. For Muslims, as for Jews and Christians, Babylon became a cautionary tale, the place where curiosity overstepped its bounds, where divine mysteries became corrupted into sorcery. Yet even as Babylon was condemned, it was also admired. To Renaissance occultists and esoteric thinkers, the idea of ancient wisdom preserved in Babylon was tantalizing. The rediscovery of cuneiform texts in the 19th century only fed this fascination, as translations revealed not only law codes and myths, but also incantations, prayers, and rituals that spoke of a worldview where magic and science intertwined. For some, this was evidence that Babylonian priests had mastered hidden forces long before modernity, forces that could still be accessed by those willing to study their texts. Babylon became, in esoteric circles, both a warning and an inspiration, a city destroyed for its hubris, but also revered as a cradle of arcane knowledge. The image of Babylon as a center of forbidden knowledge also flourished in art and literature. Medieval illuminations depicted the Tower of Babel not only as an architectural folly, but as a kind of occult machine, an attempt to pierce the heavens through magical means. In later centuries, writers like Dante placed Babylon alongside other emblems of sin, its name synonymous with pride and corruption. Yet at the same time, the allure of the exotic East and its secrets persisted. The wisdom of the Chaldeans was invoked in Renaissance texts on astrology and alchemy, while mystics sought in Mesopotamian myths symbols of cosmic truth. Babylon's gods and heroes became archetypes, reinterpreted in the language of Hermetic philosophy and Christian mysticism alike. This duality, condemnation and fascination, mirrors Babylon's deeper role in human imagination. It was remembered as both cursed and enlightened, a place of punishment and of revelation. To some, its fall was proof that divine justice cannot be mocked. To others, its memory preserved the fragments of an ancient science lost to time. In both views, Babylon remained extraordinary, larger than life, its name a cipher for humanity's uneasy relationship with knowledge. Do we seek understanding at any cost, or do we fear what lies beyond the boundaries set for us? Babylon became the stage upon which this timeless drama was played. Modern interpreters have added yet another layer. With the rise of speculative theories about extraterrestrial contact, Babylon's myths of the Anunnaki gained new resonance. To those who believe ancient civilizations were guided by visitors from the stars, Babylon is not simply a fallen city, but a site of first contact. The gods who descended, the laws given from above, the astronomical precision, these, they argue, are the fingerprints of beings not of this earth. To mainstream scholars, such claims remain unproven and often sensational, yet their popularity testifies to Babylon's ongoing power. The city still serves as a screen onto which we project our deepest questions about knowledge, power, and the unknown. Walking among its ruins today, one senses this layering of meaning. The bricks are mute, yet the imagination fills them with voices, priests chanting to Marduk, astrologers mapping the stars, angels whispering forbidden secrets, exiles singing laments, conquerors dreaming of empire. Babylon's silence is filled with echoes, and in those echoes we hear both fear and longing. It is remembered as the place where humans reached too far, where wisdom and arrogance blurred, where divine and human, sacred and profane, collided. Whether we see it as a cradle of civilization, a den of sorcery, or a point of contact with the beyond, Babylon remains a mystery we cannot ignore. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Babylon in esoteric traditions. It is not a set of specific practices or doctrines, but an image, a symbol of humanity's endless pursuit of hidden knowledge. It warns us that such pursuit can lead to ruin, yet it also reminds us that without it we would remain in ignorance. Babylon stands at the threshold of curiosity and caution, a city forever suspended between heaven and earth, between memory and myth, between what we know and what we dare to imagine. The ruins of Babylon may stand silent on the plains of Iraq, but its architecture and imagery have echoed through human imagination for more than 2,000 years. Long after its palaces and temples crumbled, the forms of Babylon, its colossal walls, its shining gates, its towering ziggurats, and its legendary gardens continued to inspire, intimidate, and fascinate. In art, literature, and architecture, Babylon became less a place than a symbol, its structures remembered as archetypes of grandeur, ambition, and mystery. The walls of Babylon are among the first images to appear in ancient accounts. Herodotus claimed they stretched so far that they encircled a city larger than any other in the world, and so thick that chariots could race along their tops. Archaeology shows that while his figures were exaggerated, the walls were indeed formidable, with double and even triple layers of brick fortifications, moats fed by the Euphrates, and gates of monumental scale. These walls became symbols of might, invoked in later cultures as metaphors for strength and security. In Jewish scripture, the walls of Babylon represented imprisonment. In Greek literature, they were marvels. In later poetry, they stood as warnings of pride. The very idea of an impregnable wall owes something to Babylon, and echoes of its image can be seen in medieval fortresses, Renaissance paintings, and even modern metaphors of political power. No monument better captured Babylon's magnificence than the Ishtar Gate. Constructed under Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century BCE, it gleamed with deep blue glazed bricks adorned with rows of lions, bulls, and dragons. Through this gate passed the processions of the Akitu festival, the New Year rite that renewed the king's mandate and bound the people to their gods. When Robert Koldewey reconstructed the gate in the early 20th century, piecing together its fragments for the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, it stunned modern audiences just as it had ancient ones. To walk beneath its reconstructed arch is to feel the weight of Babylonian artistry, the luminous color, the disciplined repetition of symbols, the impression of entering a sacred city. Artists and architects since have drawn on its motifs, its brilliant tiles, its animal guardians, as emblems of splendor and authority. Even in Fragments, the Ishtar Gate has become one of the most iconic images of the ancient world. Then there is the Ziggurat, the stepped temple tower that stood at the city's heart. Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth, was said to rise hundreds of feet above the plain, its terraces ascending towards the sky. Though now reduced to little more than foundations, the image of the Ziggurat has never left us. In the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, it is recast as an act of defiance, a monument to human arrogance punished by God. In later traditions, it was remembered as a symbol of ambition, a stairway that sought to cross the boundary between human and divine. In modern scholarship and art, the Ziggurat has been interpreted as a cosmic mountain, a reflection of humanity's eternal desire to climb higher, to reach toward mystery. Its form, stacked terraces narrowing toward the heavens, has inspired architectural metaphors for centuries, reappearing in pyramids, towers, and even skyscrapers. Every vertical monument we build carries, however faintly, the shadow of Babylon's Ziggurat. Perhaps no feature of Babylon has lingered more stubbornly in imagination than the Hanging Gardens. Though no archaeological evidence has confirmed their existence, ancient writers described them as one of the 7 wonders of the world. Terraces supported by stone vaults, watered by ingenious machinery, bursting with trees, flowers, and vines. This vision has enchanted minds for centuries. Whether they were truly built by Nebuchadnezzar for his queen, or whether they belonged to another city entirely, they became inseparable from Babylon's name. Artists painted them as lush paradises in the desert. Poets praised them as symbols of abundance, and architects used them as inspiration for terraced gardens and elaborate landscapes. Their absence in the ruins has only heightened their allure. They represent not just a wonder of engineering, but the power of legend to outlive stone. Babylon's imagery also seeped into literature. Medieval manuscripts illustrated the Tower of Babel as a spiraling tower, a structure that in some depictions resembles Gothic cathedrals, in others Renaissance fortresses, in others proto-modern industrial towers. Artists adapted its form to suit their own times, turning Babylon into a warning for their own societies. Peter Bruegel's 16th-century paintings of the tower, with their dizzying detail and vast scale, show Babylon not as an ancient city, but as a metaphor for contemporary Europe's ambitions and fragilities. In such works, Babylon became timeless, a symbol adaptable to any age that wrestled with pride, diversity, and collapse. Even in modern architecture, echoes of Babylon persist. The terraced form of the hanging gardens inspired designs for botanical gardens, palatial estates, and even skyscrapers adorned with greenery. The image of monumental gates, derived from the Ishtar Gate, appears in triumphal arches and ceremonial entrances across the world. The Ziggurat has been reborn in stepped pyramids, from Mayan temples to modern buildings that seek to blend geometry with symbolism. Babylon's forms have never truly vanished. They have been reinterpreted again and again, proof that the city's architecture still speaks to something deep in the human imagination. What makes this legacy so striking is that much of it is as much myth as reality. The walls were real, but their scale was exaggerated. The gardens may never have existed, yet they are immortal. The Ziggurat's ruins lie low today, yet the Tower of Babel looms tall in the mind. Babylon's artistry lives at the intersection of fact and story, reminding us that architecture is not only built of stone, but also of memory. The city's influence lies not only in what it actually constructed, but in how it was imagined, described, and reimagined through centuries of retelling. To stand among its ruins now is to feel both presence and absence. The sun bakes the mud brick foundations, the Euphrates flows quietly nearby, and fragments of walls still rise in jagged outlines. Yet in the mind's eye, the city still towers. Gates glow blue, gardens hang lush with greenery, terraces climb toward the heavens. The ruins themselves become a canvas onto which imagination paints, guided by texts, myths, and longing. And in that act of imagination, Babylon endures. Its architecture remains alive not because its stones survived intact, but because its forms became archetypes, symbols of ambition, beauty, and transience that every age could adapt. Babylon's artistic and architectural legacy thus reminds us of the power of image. More than any single brick or temple, it is the vision of Babylon, the walls, the gates, the ziggurats, the gardens that has shaped human culture. It is the city that never truly died, because it became more than a place. It became a symbol, reborn in art and architecture, wherever humans sought to express both the heights of ambition and the inevitability of decline. In this way, Babylon continues to rise, terrace upon terrace, in the imagination of every age. When the bricks of Babylon crumbled, the city did not vanish. Instead, it took on a second life as a metaphor, a symbol that would outlast its ruins by centuries. To later peoples, Babylon became more than a place on a map. It became an idea, one that could be invoked to describe tyranny, decadence, or the arrogance of empires that rose too high. From the Hebrew prophets to Christian theologians, from medieval chroniclers to modern revolutionaries, Babylon was a name that carried with it a warning. The physical city may have fallen, but in texts and traditions, it lived on as the embodiment of oppression and excess. The seeds of this transformation lie in the Hebrew Bible. For the people of Judah, Babylon was not merely a foreign power. It was the conqueror that destroyed their temple, razed their city, and carried their elites into exile. This trauma etched itself into memory, and in the writings of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Babylon is described not only as a military aggressor, but as a place cursed for its pride. These prophets wrote of a city drunk on its own power, doomed to fall like a beast brought low. The exile was not only political, it was spiritual, and Babylon came to represent the forces that stood against divine justice. Even when Persia allowed the exiles to return, the name Babylon continued to carry the weight of oppression, a reminder of what it meant to live under foreign domination. By the time of the New Testament, the metaphor of Babylon had deepened. The book of Revelation, written in a time when Rome held sway, described Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Here Babylon was no longer the literal city on the Euphrates, which by then lay in ruins, but a code name for Rome, the empire that persecuted early Christians. The author used the imagery of Babylon to cloak his critique in symbolic language, describing a city clothed in purple and scarlet, drunk on the blood of saints, destined to be consumed by fire. For generations of Christians, this image of Babylon became synonymous with corruption and worldly power, a warning against the seductions of empire and wealth. Babylon was Rome, but it was also every empire that rose on the backs of the oppressed. This symbolic power did not remain confined to theology. In medieval Europe, Babylon was invoked as a stand-in for vice and heresy. Preachers warned of Babylonian captivity, a phrase Martin Luther later used to denounce what he saw as the corruption of the medieval church. For reformers, Babylon represented the institution that had strayed from its spiritual mission and become intoxicated by power and wealth. In this sense, Babylon was no longer an ancient ruin, but a living metaphor applied to their own time, reshaped to fit their struggles. The metaphor extended beyond religion into politics and art. In literature, Babylon was painted as a city of temptation, a place where pride and indulgence reigned unchecked. Renaissance writers described tyrants as new kings of Babylon, rulers whose downfall was inevitable. In music and poetry, Babylon became the symbol of exile, both literal and spiritual. The famous psalm that begins, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept," became a song of longing for freedom, sung not just by Jews in antiquity, but by enslaved peoples across centuries who saw in Babylon the embodiment of their captors. This resonance is perhaps most visible in modern times in the Caribbean and the African diaspora, where Babylon has become a symbol of systemic oppression. In Rastafarian thought, Babylon represents the colonial powers and social systems that exploit and enslave. It is the name given to governments, laws, and institutions that enforce inequality. To call something Babylon is to declare it corrupt, unjust, and hostile to human freedom. Reggae music gave this metaphor global reach, with songs invoking Babylon as the enemy of liberation. In this tradition, Babylon lives on as a warning against the machinery of oppression, an echo of ancient trauma reinterpreted for modern struggle. What makes Babylon such a lasting metaphor is its flexibility. It can stand for any empire, any system, any institution that rises too high and loses its soul. It can mean Rome in the time of Revelation, the papacy in the eyes of Luther, colonial powers in the Caribbean, or even modern states accused of corruption. Its ruins may rest quietly in Iraq, but its name is spoken in sermons, songs, and speeches across the world. In each context, it carries the same weight. Beware of pride, beware of empire, beware of forgetting that all power eventually falls. Yet, it is worth remembering that behind the metaphor was once a real city, with real people who prayed, traded, built, and dreamed. The name has been shaped by the trauma of conquest and exile, but the Babylonian people themselves were not the caricature of vice that later traditions made them out to be. They were farmers who watched the seasons, scribes who copied down laws and star charts, builders who raised walls and gates. The metaphor of Babylon is powerful, but it is also incomplete, a mirror that reflects more about those who used it than about those who lived there. In this way, Babylon exists on two levels, as history and as symbol. As history, it was a city that rose and fell, that built monuments and left behind ruins. As symbol, it became larger than life, an enduring shorthand for the dangers of power and excess. Both levels matter, for both remind us of how humans turn places into stories and stories into warnings. When we speak of Babylon, we are not only remembering an ancient capital, we are also speaking to our own anxieties about empire, justice, and the fragility of human ambition. The paradox of Babylon is that its downfall made it immortal. Had it remained a thriving city, it might have faded into the ordinary record of empires. But its destruction, and the way it was remembered by those it conquered, ensured its name would outlive it. Today, Babylon is a ruin, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a cluster of mud brick walls under the Mesopotamian sun. Yet it is also a word charged with meaning, capable of stirring fear, anger, or longing. To walk among its ruins is to see the gap between what was and what it has come to mean. And in that gap lies the power of metaphor, the power of Babylon, still alive, still whispering its warning across centuries. For centuries, Babylon lived mostly in imagination, a ghost conjured through scripture, legend, and moral allegory. Travelers passed near the Euphrates, noting mounds of mud brick and stretches of desolate plain. But few could match the ruins before their eyes with the city described in ancient texts. To most Europeans in the early modern period, Babylon was more symbol than sight. A city of sin whose remnants were too eroded to command attention. That began to change in the 19th century, when archaeology emerged as both science and spectacle. What lay beneath the dust of Mesopotamia could now be uncovered, catalogued, and displayed. And Babylon, long shrouded in metaphor, began to re-emerge as something tangible. In the 1800s, Western explorers and diplomats ventured into Ottoman-controlled Iraq, drawn by curiosity and the desire to match biblical names with physical remains. They found mounds near the village of Hilla that local lore already identified as the ruins of Babylon. Travelers wrote about fragments of brick stamped with cuneiform, scattered across the plain. Some carried these bricks back to Europe, where scholars puzzled over their markings. For the first time in centuries, Babylon began to shift from an allegory into an archaeological problem. What had once been a word for sin was becoming a site to be excavated, mapped, and reconstructed. The real turning point came with the work of German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, who arrived at Babylon in 1899 under the sponsorship of the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft. Koldewey and his team would remain for nearly 2 decades, conducting one of the most ambitious excavations of the age. They uncovered foundations of walls, gates, and palaces, revealing a city plan that matched ancient descriptions more closely than many had dared hope. Mud brick by mud brick, the Babylon of legend was reborn as a ruin that could be studied. Among their most spectacular finds was the Ishtar Gate, decorated with rows of lions, dragons, and bulls molded in glazed blue brick. This monumental gateway, once part of the processional way through the city, became the centerpiece of Koldewey's work. In a controversial move typical of the time, large sections of the gate were removed and transported to Berlin, where they were reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum. Visitors walking beneath its shining blue surface felt as though they had stepped into the heart of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. The gate became one of the icons of Near Eastern archaeology, but its removal also raised difficult questions about cultural heritage and ownership, questions that still linger today. The discoveries at Babylon reshaped the way modern people thought about the ancient city. Until then, much of what was known came from biblical denunciations or classical descriptions colored by wonder and scorn. Archaeology provided another layer. Inscriptions naming kings, city walls stretching across the desert, temples built to house gods whose names had not been spoken aloud for millennia. These finds gave Babylon a material reality that cut against its reputation as a city of sin. It was, instead, a city of builders, administrators, priests, and artists. The same Nebuchadnezzar, remembered as a tyrant in Scripture, emerged in his own inscriptions as a patron of great building works, a king obsessed with restoring temples and making his capital a wonder of the world. Yet archaeology did not erase the metaphorical Babylon. It complicated it. Now the city was both ruin and warning, both the subject of excavation and of prophecy. Scholars published site plans and translations of cuneiform tablets, but preachers and writers continued to invoke Babylon as a symbol of corruption. In this way, 2 Babylons began to coexist: the scientific Babylon, built brick by brick in scholarly publications and museum halls, and the symbolic Babylon, invoked in sermons, political speeches, and songs. Each drew strength from the other. The more archaeology revealed the grandeur of Nebuchadnezzar's city, the more compelling the biblical warning seemed, for here was proof that such magnificence could indeed be brought low. The rediscovery also revealed details that challenged or reshaped long-held assumptions. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, remained elusive. No definitive archaeological evidence of them was uncovered at Babylon, leading some scholars to suggest they may have existed in Nineveh instead. This absence reminded researchers that memory, myth, and material evidence do not always align. Similarly, the Tower of Babel, described as a hubristic monument to human pride, may have corresponded to the Anunnaki Ziggurat. Excavations revealed its foundations, suggesting that the legendary tower had been a real structure, rebuilt and restored by successive kings. But what it meant to those who built it, and how it became the symbol of confusion in later texts, was another matter entirely. As the 20th century unfolded, Babylon's ruins became caught up in new political struggles. In Iraq, rulers sought to reclaim Babylon as a symbol of national pride, restoring sections of its walls and celebrating its ancient kings as forebears of modern nationhood. Saddam Hussein, in particular, tied his image to Nebuchadnezzar, inscribing his own name on bricks used in reconstruction and hosting festivals that linked Iraq's identity to Babylon's grandeur. For many, this politicization blurred the line between archaeology and propaganda, raising uncomfortable echoes of Babylon's symbolic past as a tool of power. The city that had once stood as a warning against arrogance was now being used to project authority once again. Today, Babylon exists at multiple levels of meaning. Tourists walk among reconstructed walls, while archaeologists continue to study tablets and foundations. In museums around the world, fragments of its gates and artifacts tell a story of empire and artistry. In churches, mosques, and songs, Babylon is still invoked as the emblem of corruption and exile. And in Iraq, the ruins stand as both heritage and reminder, fragile beneath the desert sun. UNESCO's designation of Babylon as a World Heritage Site in 2019 was a recognition of its importance, not just to Iraq, but to humanity as a whole. A city that belongs to the world's collective memory. What the rediscovery of Babylon has shown is that ruins are never neutral. They are interpreted, claimed, and contested. Babylon's bricks carry the marks of ancient kings, but also of modern archaeologists, colonial powers, and nationalist regimes. To speak of Babylon today is to speak of archaeology and politics, myth and memory, pride and destruction. It is to walk through a landscape where every stone has been read and reread, each interpretation layered atop the other like the strata of the city itself. And yet standing at the site, one can still feel something older than all these interpretations. The sweep of the desert, the outline of mud brick walls, the whisper of the Euphrates nearby, it evokes a sense of continuity. Babylon may be symbol, metaphor, or museum exhibit, but it is also a place where people once lived, worshipped, and dreamed. Its rediscovery does not end the story. It adds another chapter. And as with all things Babylonian, that chapter is written as much in the present as in the past. Even after archaeologists dug up its bricks and reconstructed its gates, Babylon never returned to being just another ancient city. It refused to stay confined to the past. Instead, it slipped into the bloodstream of modern culture, reappearing in novels, films, songs, and political speeches. Babylon became more than ruins. It became a symbol, a code word that could mean decadence, empire, danger, or lost beauty depending on who invoked it. This is perhaps Babylon's most enduring legacy, not merely the city that was, but the city we imagine again and again. In literature, Babylon appears both as a historical backdrop and as a metaphor. Romantic poets of the 19th century, inspired by the first archaeological reports, painted Babylon as a haunting reminder of human pride undone by time. Percy Bysshe Shelley, for instance, in his vision of ruined empires, evoked Babylon as a ghostly echo of lost grandeur. Later, novelists wove Babylon into stories of mystery and intrigue. Jorge Luis Borges, fascinated by labyrinths and symbols, described The Lottery in Babylon, a tale that transforms the city into an allegory of chance, fate, and hidden order. In Borges's version, Babylon is not bricks and gates, but an idea, a city where reality itself bends under invisible rules. Cinema also found fertile ground in Babylon. Silent films of the early 20th century used it as a backdrop for spectacle. D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, 1916, featured massive sets depicting the city's walls and palaces, filled with extras in elaborate costumes. Though historically inaccurate, these images left a deep imprint, shaping the public's mental picture of Babylon as a city of excess and splendor. Later films, from biblical epics to historical dramas, recycled the imagery. Towering ziggurats, feasts overflowing with wine and dancers, tyrant kings glaring down from gilded thrones. Babylon became a shorthand for opulence on the brink of collapse. Music, too, has kept Babylon alive. Reggae musicians, especially those within the Rastafari movement, turned Babylon into a central metaphor. For them, Babylon meant the oppressive systems of colonialism, racism, and exploitation. To live under Babylon was to live under corrupt worldly power, while liberation came through spiritual resistance. Bob Marley sang of escaping from Babylon, reimagining the ancient city as a modern empire of oppression. This reinterpretation shows how Babylon's symbolic weight could shift with context, once a biblical warning, then a colonial critique. The city's ruins in Mesopotamia mattered less than the idea of Babylon as domination. Even in popular music beyond reggae, Babylon surfaces again and again. From David Gray's haunting ballad Babylon to hip-hop lyrics that use the name to signify corruption, temptation, or urban struggle, the word carries resonance far beyond archaeology. Babylon is no longer Nebuchadnezzar's alone. It belongs to anyone who needs a symbol for power's dark side. Conspiracy theories, too, found a home in Babylon. Some claim that the ruins still hide secrets of ancient technologies, perhaps linked to the biblical Tower of Babel or to extraterrestrial visitors. In these narratives, Babylon becomes a cipher for forbidden knowledge, suppressed by elites or lost to catastrophe. Websites and fringe writers link Babylon to everything from the Illuminati to alien contact, drawing on the city's long association with mystery and divine rebellion. For them, Babylon is not just the past, but the hidden engine of the present. Political rhetoric also borrows Babylon's power. Throughout the 20th century, leaders and revolutionaries invoked Babylon as a warning. To call a city or nation Babylon was to accuse it of arrogance and inevitable downfall. American evangelists described modern metropolises as new Babylons, centers of moral decay. Revolutionary leaders in other parts of the world used Babylon to denounce Western imperialism, comparing foreign powers to Nebuchadnezzar's pride. The word became a weapon, sharpened by centuries of association with hubris and judgment. Even video games have embraced Babylon. In strategy games like Civilization, players can raise Babylon as one of humanity's great empires, advancing through technologies and wonders. In role-playing games, Babylon sometimes appears as a mythic city, a place of arcane knowledge or supernatural corruption. These digital Babylons, though far removed from history, show how the name still sparks imagination. The ruins may stand in Iraq, but the idea of Babylon travels into virtual worlds, reinvented for new generations. What is striking is how flexible Babylon's image has been. For some, it is a warning of arrogance punished. For others, a symbol of oppression to resist. For still others, a source of wonder and nostalgia. The real city, its bricks, its gates, its archives, has become one layer among many. Babylon lives as much in imagination as in archaeology, in the shifting cultural meanings people attach to it. This dual existence complicates how we understand heritage. When UNESCO named Babylon a World Heritage Site, it recognized its universal value as a human achievement. But at the same time, Babylon, the symbol, continues to haunt culture, politics, and religion in ways no designation can contain. A ruin of mud brick in the desert becomes, in a song or a sermon, a metaphor for Wall Street, for colonialism, or for a world out of balance. Why does Babylon endure in this way, when so many other ancient cities fade into obscurity? Perhaps it is because Babylon was already a symbol in antiquity. The Bible cast it as a villain, Greek historians as a wonder, Mesopotamian kings as the center of the cosmos. From the beginning, Babylon was more than itself. It was both place and story, both city and symbol. That elasticity allowed it to migrate into later imaginations, carrying different meanings in different contexts. And so, Babylon lives on, not just in the mounds near Hilla or in the glazed bricks of Berlin's museum, but in reggae lyrics, Hollywood sets, conspiracy forums, and political speeches. The city has become a mirror, reflecting whatever fears or desires the present projects onto it. Babylon is collapse, oppression, splendor, temptation, knowledge, and danger all at once. Its ruins tell one story, but its symbol tells many more. In the end, perhaps this is Babylon's true immortality. Cities rise and fall, empires crumble, bricks erode. But symbols endure, morphing into new forms, adapting to new voices. Babylon's bricks may crumble in the desert sun, but the idea of Babylon will not die. It continues to whisper through culture, calling us back to that ancient city on the Euphrates, asking us what we see when we imagine its name. When people hear the word Babylon, one of the first images that comes to mind is not a wall or a garden, but a tower. The Tower of Babel, as told in the Book of Genesis, is one of the most enduring tales ever attached to the city. In the story, humanity once spoke a single language and lived in unity. They set out to build a tower tall enough to reach the heavens, a monument to their ambition and power. But God, displeased with their pride, scattered them by confusing their tongues, so that no one understood another. The great tower was abandoned, and from that moment, the world became divided by languages. This story, though not part of Babylon's own records, became forever linked to it, partly because the name Babel sounded to Hebrew writers like Balal, meaning confusion, and partly because Mesopotamia was known for its massive temple towers, or ziggurats. To the biblical imagination, Babylon's ziggurats must have looked like stairways reaching the sky. And so Babylon became the site not only of empire and exile, but of humanity's linguistic fracture. For centuries, the Tower of Babel was interpreted as a warning against pride. The idea that people, by uniting in ambition, could challenge the divine order was troubling to ancient storytellers. The scattering of languages was not just punishment, but a limit imposed on human arrogance. Yet the story carried more than just theological weight. It shaped how people thought about the diversity of languages itself. Language became not a natural outgrowth of human variety, but a curse, a mark of division stamped onto humanity by a higher power. During the Middle Ages, scholars and theologians wrestled with the implications of Babel. Some believed that Hebrew was the original language of Eden, preserved in fragments after the fall of the tower. Others speculated that Latin or even the language of angels might have been humanity's first speech. Explorers who encountered new languages in Africa, Asia, or the Americas often explained them by referring back to Babel, seeing each strange tongue as part of the ancient scattering. The myth gave a framework, however flawed, for understanding the world's bewildering linguistic diversity. The Renaissance brought new twists. As Europeans studied ancient texts and languages, they sought to recover what they imagined was the lost tongue of paradise. Projects emerged to create universal languages that could undo the confusion of Babel. Philosophers like John Wilkins in the 17th century tried to design languages based on logical systems, hoping they could transcend cultural barriers. These efforts were direct descendants of the Babel myth, attempts to rebuild what had been broken, to undo God's scattering with human ingenuity. Though these artificial languages never caught on, the dream of universal communication lingered, echoing the ancient tower's ambition. In modern times, the Babel story continues to resonate, though in new ways. Linguists now study language families, evolution, and the deep history of speech without resorting to divine punishment. Yet the metaphor of Babel still appears whenever people confront the challenges of communication across cultures. The creation of Esperanto in the 19th century, for example, was explicitly framed as an antidote to Babel, a man-made language that could restore unity. International organizations, from the League of Nations to the United Nations, wrestled with translation as a modern Babel problem. How do you foster cooperation when everyone speaks differently? Technology has reshaped this question yet again. Today, translation software and AI models can bridge languages in real time, creating the illusion of reversing Babel's curse. For the first time in history, humanity may approach a point where language diversity is no longer an insurmountable barrier. And yet, the myth of Babel warns us that communication is not only about words, it is also about power, ambition, and the risks of trying to reach too high. The digital tower we build with satellites, algorithms, and networks may not be made of bricks, but it echoes the same dream: a single, unified voice for humanity. Art and literature keep returning to the tower as a symbol. Painters from Pieter Bruegel to modern surrealists have depicted it as a spiraling, unfinished giant, both majestic and doomed. Writers like Jorge Luis Borges and Umberto Eco used Babel as a metaphor for infinite libraries, endless texts, or chaotic systems of knowledge. In these portrayals, the tower is not just a building, but a mirror of human ambition, always striving upward, always incomplete, always collapsing under its own weight. Babylon's association with the tower also gave the city a reputation as the cradle of confusion. To call something Babel is to say it is noisy, chaotic, impossible to navigate. This has seeped into everyday language. Stock markets described as a Babel of voices, cities as a Babel of tongues. The ancient story lives on as a metaphor we reach for when words fail us. Yet there is another way to read the Babel myth. Instead of seeing linguistic diversity as a curse, some scholars and thinkers reinterpret it as a gift. After all, The scattering of languages created the richness of human culture, poetry, and thought. Without it, there would be no Homer in Greek, no Confucius in Chinese, no Shakespeare in English. The multiplicity of voices, born from the tower's collapse, is what made human civilization as we know it possible. In this sense, Babel is not just a story of punishment, but of creativity, a moment when the world blossomed into difference. This alternative reading resonates today in an era of globalization. While technology tempts us to erase differences and create seamless communication, the Babel story reminds us that variety can be a source of strength. The challenge is not to rebuild a single tower, but to listen across languages without erasing them. Babylon, then, becomes more than a ruin on the Euphrates. It becomes a stage on which humanity tells the story of its voice, its longing for unity, its fear of division, its dream of reaching heaven, and its realization of fragility. The city's real towers may be gone, its ziggurats melted into mud, but the imagined tower rises every time we confront the limits of understanding. In this way, the Tower of Babel continues Babylon's strange immortality. It links the city to questions that will never be settled. How should humans speak to one another? What happens when ambition outpaces humility? Can unity exist without erasing difference? Babylon's ruins may answer nothing, but its myth continues to pose the questions. And so the shadow of the tower still falls across us. From ancient tablets to modern code, from clay bricks to digital networks, the dream of Babel persists. It is the dream of building something so vast it transcends division, and the warning that such dreams always come with a price. In the modern age, Babylon did not simply fade into quiet dust. Its ruins, though weathered, continued to speak to the ambitions of those who came after. In the late 19th century, European archaeologists, driven by a mixture of curiosity, imperial rivalry, and a hunger for prestige, descended upon Mesopotamia. Among them was Robert Koldewey, a German archaeologist whose team began excavating Babylon in 1899. For nearly 2 decades, his expedition unearthed vast portions of the city, the foundations of palaces, fragments of the Ishtar Gate, and the outlines of the processional way. The Germans carefully removed many of these treasures and shipped them back to Berlin, where the Ishtar Gate was reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum. It still stands there today, a dazzling wall of blue glazed bricks and roaring lions, thousands of miles from the soil that birthed it. To some, it is a triumph of preservation. To others, it is a reminder of how Western powers carried away the heart of ancient civilizations for their own display. Yet the story of Babylon's modern revival was not only about archaeologists. It was also about rulers who saw in its ruins a mirror for their own power. None pursued this more aggressively than Saddam Hussein. From the 1970s onward, Saddam cast himself as the heir of Nebuchadnezzar II, the great king who had once rebuilt Babylon in glory. He poured resources into reconstructing parts of the city, laying modern bricks stamped with his own name alongside ancient foundations. This was built by Saddam Hussein, son of Nebuchadnezzar, the inscriptions proclaimed. Palaces rose over the ruins, mosaics and murals linked Saddam to Babylon's legendary rulers, and festivals were staged to present Iraq as the inheritor of Mesopotamian greatness. To many Iraqis, the spectacle was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. On one hand, it was a reclamation of their history, a declaration that Iraq's roots went back not just to Islam or the Arab world, but to the dawn of civilization itself. On the other, it was a transparent attempt by a dictator to wrap himself in the mantle of myth. Saddam used Babylon as propaganda, a stage on which to dramatize his ambitions of empire. The irony was not lost on observers. Nebuchadnezzar had once been remembered as the conqueror who destroyed Jerusalem, while Saddam courted the language of resistance against Israel. The parallels were convenient, but also selective, reshaped to suit the needs of modern politics. When the Gulf War erupted in 1991, Babylon's ruins were caught in the turmoil. Coalition bombs struck near the site, and military activity scarred part of the landscape. But the greater damage would come after 2003, when U.S.-led forces invaded Iraq and toppled Saddam. Babylon, once again, became a battlefield, not of kings and priests this time, but of armies and tanks. American and Polish troops built a military base on the site, covering the ancient earth with helipads and roads. Sandbags were filled with fragments of archaeological debris. Heavy vehicles crushed fragile brickwork. In the chaos of war, the ruins of Babylon suffered indignities that even centuries of neglect had not inflicted. The world's archaeologists raised alarm, condemning the occupation as cultural vandalism. UNESCO called it a tragedy, noting that a site belonging to all humanity had been sacrificed to the needs of a modern conflict. Iraqis themselves were torn between outrage and exhaustion. For some, Babylon was a reminder of pride. For others, it had become another casualty of endless violence. Once again, the city's legacy was less about its ancient past than about how modern powers wielded its name. Yet even amid this damage, the myth of Babylon endured. Saddam's attempt to revive the city may have been tainted by dictatorship, but it rekindled interest in its heritage. After the invasion, Iraqi scholars and communities called for restoration, not only to repair physical damage, but to reclaim their history from both looters and occupiers. Projects funded by UNESCO and other international bodies have since worked to stabilize the ruins, to prevent the last traces of Babylon from vanishing into the desert wind. But the story of modern Babylon is also one of perception in the wider world. In the West, especially in American religious and political culture, the word Babylon retained its biblical weight. Preachers used it as shorthand for decadence, corruption, and hubris. Some even framed Saddam's rebuilding project as the fulfillment of prophecy, a sign that the biblical Babylon was rising again before the end times. This apocalyptic rhetoric bled into popular imagination, feeding books, sermons, and films. Babylon was no longer just an archaeological site. It was a symbol of everything fragile, dangerous, or sinful about human ambition. In music and literature, the word Babylon also gained new meanings. Reggae artists like Bob Marley and Peter Tosh used it to describe oppressive systems, a metaphor for colonialism, inequality, and spiritual exile. To Rastafarians, Babylon meant not a place on the Euphrates, but the structures of modern power that enslaved and divided. In this sense, Babylon became global shorthand for empire itself, a name for the forces that corrupt and dominate. Its ancient ruins, though distant, became a universal symbol of the struggle against domination. Meanwhile, in Iraq itself, Babylon remains both a wound and a source of pride. Tourists, though limited by instability, still come to see the ruins. Iraqi archaeologists continue to study the fragments, piecing together the lives of the people who lived there. The government seeks to balance heritage with modern needs, wary of repeating Saddam's excesses, but also unwilling to let Babylon fade into silence. In 2019, UNESCO finally designated Babylon as a World Heritage Site, recognizing both its global significance and the urgent need to protect it. For Iraqis, this was more than an international honor. It was a step toward reclaiming their history from decades of exploitation, destruction, and myth-making. Babylon today is not the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar or of Saddam. It is a fragile set of ruins, scarred but still standing, its bricks eroded but not erased. Yet in the imagination of the world, it remains immense. To walk there is to feel the weight of thousands of years of stories layered on top of one another. Biblical judgment, imperial ambition, colonial archaeology, nationalist propaganda, military occupation. Each generation has written its own version of Babylon, sometimes on the tablets of clay, sometimes in the speeches of dictators, sometimes in the rubble left by tanks. The persistence of Babylon in modern times shows that some places never stop being theaters for human dreams. Even in ruin, the city attracts rulers and armies, poets and prophets. It becomes a canvas for ambition, whether to rule like Nebuchadnezzar, to resist like the exiles of Judah, or to condemn like the preachers who saw America itself as a modern Babylon. The city's physical remains may crumble, but the word Babylon still carries enough power to shape politics, faith, and culture. As the 21st century unfolds, Babylon stands at a crossroads. Will it be preserved as a monument of human heritage, carefully protected for future generations? Or will it continue to be reshaped, scarred, and exploited by those who see in it a tool for their own ambitions? The ruins themselves are silent, but their story is not. Babylon remains a mirror, reflecting the dreams and follies of those who gaze upon it. As the journey through Babylon's past draws to a close, what lingers is not only the image of ruined walls and broken bricks, but the sense of a city that has never truly died. Few places on earth have carried so many layers of meaning, so many projections of fear, hope, ambition, and loss. Babylon began as a cluster of villages by the Euphrates, humble and unremarkable, yet it grew into a stage where the fate of kingdoms was decided. Kings built palaces and temples, priests read omens in the stars, merchants carried goods across deserts, and captives wept by the rivers, remembering their lost homes. Every stone, every inscription, every myth carried forward a fragment of this story. The myths endured because they spoke not only to the people of Babylon, but to those who lived beyond its walls. When the Hebrew scribes wrote of exile, Babylon became more than a city. It became a symbol of oppression and faith tested in fire. When Greek historians wrote of the hanging gardens and the tower that touched the heavens, Babylon became a wonder of the world. When Christian prophets declared that Babylon the Great would fall, it became the eternal caution against pride and decadence. The city was not merely remembered, it was transformed into an idea that could outlast time itself. This transformation is perhaps Babylon's most extraordinary legacy. Unlike many ancient cities that lie forgotten beneath fields and sands, Babylon remained present in the cultural imagination. Each age found a new way to retell its story. For artists, it was a symbol of beauty and ruin. For rulers, it was a mantle of legitimacy, or a warning of hubris. For theologians, it was the shorthand for sin and corruption. For musicians and poets of the modern era, it was the metaphor for systems that enslave and oppress. In every retelling, the real city faded a little, and the myth grew stronger. Yet when one walks among the ruins today, it is not myth that one feels, but silence. The desert wind sweeps across the crumbling walls of Nebuchadnezzar's palace. The outlines of the processional way remain faint but visible, once alive with lions and dragons marching in colored brick. The Euphrates still flows nearby, slower now, as if weary of carrying so many stories on its banks. There are no hanging gardens, no tower piercing the sky, no bustling crowds. There is only the ghost of greatness, and with it, the humbling reminder that time spares no empire, however mighty. But perhaps this is the lesson Babylon has always carried. Its rise and fall remind us that human ambition can reach staggering heights, but that every height comes with a cost. The city that once claimed to touch the heavens eventually sank into dust. The kings who inscribed their victories into stone could not inscribe eternity. The very bricks that bore Nebuchadnezzar's name were later stamped with Saddam Hussein's, and both have crumbled. Power may claim permanence, but history whispers otherwise. At the same time, Babylon teaches something else, that memory is more enduring than stone. The ruins may be broken, but the idea of Babylon remains vibrant. It persists in sacred texts, in museum halls, in music, in the speeches of politicians, in the sermons of preachers. It persists because it speaks to a universal truth about the human condition, the desire to build, to dominate, to outlast, and the inevitability of decline. Babylon is both a triumph and a warning, a mirror held up to every civilization that believes itself immune to time. For the people of Iraq, Babylon is also a legacy of identity. Beyond the myths and prophecies, beyond the appropriation by archaeologists and dictators, it is their heritage. The ancient city reminds them that the soil of Mesopotamia gave birth not only to Babylon, but to the very foundations of civilization: writing, law, astronomy, and myth. In the face of war and ruin, this heritage is not something to be discarded, but something to be protected, studied, and cherished. When UNESCO named Babylon a World Heritage Site, it was more than a symbolic gesture. It was an acknowledgement that the city belongs to humanity as a whole, but also that it is rooted in the lives of the people who live beside it still. In the end, Babylon's story is not one of final endings, but of continual rebirth in imagination. Every time its name is spoken, a fragment of the city rises again. It rises in the verses of the prophets, in the painted lions of the Ishtar Gate in Berlin, in the reggae songs of Rastafarians, in the ruins where archaeologists kneel with brushes and notebooks. It rises when we speak of Babylons, of excess and decadence in our own time, warning us not to repeat the same mistakes. It rises whenever a civilization, flush with pride, is reminded that even the greatest can fall. Perhaps that is why Babylon still matters. It is not just the story of a city long gone, but the story of us all. Every generation builds its towers, raises its walls, and believes it can outlast the tide of history. And every generation, eventually, sees those towers fall. But in the ruins lies continuity, not despair. The memory of Babylon ensures that we remember both the greatness we can achieve and the humility we must carry. To walk through Babylon's ruins is to stand in the middle of time itself. Past and present collapse into one another. The bricks, stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, lie beneath modern scars of war. The echoes of ancient processions mingle with the silence of tourists and soldiers alike. And somewhere within that silence is the faint sound of voices, scribes inscribing clay, captives singing lamentations, priests calling to the gods. These voices, though faint, are not gone. They remind us that history is not just dates and monuments, but lived experience, fragile yet enduring. As night falls over the Euphrates, the ruins of Babylon glow in the fading light. The city that once defied time is now a patient witness to it. Empires have come and gone, armies have marched and retreated, and still the ruins remain, fragile yet resilient. Babylon doesn't speak, but it doesn't need to. Its story is etched into us. It asks us to remember, to reflect, to question our own towers, our own empires, our own belief in permanence. And it asks us to listen, to the silence, to the myths, to the lessons written in dust and stone. For Babylon is not gone. It lives wherever we tell its story, wherever we confront its echoes in our world. It lives because we cannot let it die, because in its rise and fall, we glimpse the eternal cycle of human history. The city is a ruin, but the idea of Babylon is immortal, and so long as we speak its name, it will never truly be silent.